In The Peoples of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien identifies the point at which his father first discerned the appearance of an entirely new civilization out of the east. They appeared in connection with the death of Narmekil II, King of Gondor, in Third Age 1856. J.R.R. Tolkien originally ascribed the king's death to the Sorcerer King, later known as the Witch King, chief of the Nazgul, but rewrote the passage as follows. Men out of the east, a fierce people riding in great wains, came against Gondor, doubtless stirred up by Sauron and Ulyri, ringwraiths. Narmekil, slain in battle. As Christopher Tolkien notes, this was the first appearance of the Wainriders. Their arrival in the Legendarium heralds a new dimension to the wars of the Third Age. Rather than a relatively simple struggle between the slaves of Sauron and the descendants of Numenor, the conflict broadens, both in geographical scope and in narrative depth. In this phase of history, we can observe Sauron operating more subtly, not openly through his own agents and armies, but working in a more limited capacity, behind the scenes, to direct the aggression of the vast East against the men of the West. The Wainriders provide the closest look we get into the east of Middle-earth, its peoples and its warfare. Still, the details are sparse. In what follows, we will piece together the outlines of the Wainrider Wars, a nearly 100-year period that saw two kings of Gondor slain in the field of battle and involved peoples from across the known world. The Wainrider invasion redrew the map of Middle-earth, shifting the borders of Gondor and setting the Northmen of Rivanion on a new course. We will examine the peoples, arms, and strategies involved in these conflicts, and take a closer look at a fascinating and somewhat overlooked period in Middle-earth history. In order to put the Wainriders in context, it will be useful to get a sense of prior Easterling attacks and the geopolitical situation of Western Middle-earth in the lead-up to their emergence. The East occupies an interesting place in the symbolism of Middle-earth. During the War of the Ring, it is largely a shorthand for Mordor, the land of the enemy. But at other points in the history of Arda, it was more ambivalent. On the one hand, the first elves and men awoke in the East. On the other, the East was also a land of unknowns, at least from the perspective of the stories we have access to. In a 1966 interview, Tolkien stated that Rune is the Elvish word for East, Asia, China, Japan, and all the things which people in the West regard as far away. How far away does the east of Middle-earth extend? Thanks to some new information in the nature of Middle-earth, we can get a greater sense of the dimensions of the eastern lands, at least in the very earliest times. For many, Karen Wynne Fonstad's Atlas of Middle-earth has provided a picture of what these territories may have looked like. Fonstad placed Cuiviénen, the location of the Elves' awakening, fairly far to the east, and only about 300 miles from the East Sea. She placed Hildorien, where men awoke, about 300 miles to the southeast of Cuiviénen. Additionally, the Sea of Rune does not appear on Fonstad's map of this period. The picture of the east is of a fairly narrow land, then. However, since the Atlas's publication, new writings have come to light which must revise these interpretations. The East was a much larger place, according to the nature of Middle-earth. First, Tolkien asserts that the Sea of Rune was in fact present during the westward march of the Elves. They had traveled some 450 miles westward or northwestward from Cuiviénen to reach its eastern shore. If both the Sea of Rune and the Sea of Helcar were present, Cuiviénen was probably located southeast from the Sea of Rune. If it lay due east, then the Sea of Helcar must have been small indeed. We do not know for certain whether the Sea of Helcar survived into the Third Age, only that to Cuiviénen there is no returning. This may suggest that Helcar was drained in the cataclysms of the First Age, but whatever the scale of the destruction, it was apparently not great enough to obliterate the Sea of Rune. There may be some reason, then, to believe that lands further east remained in some fashion. On the one hand, Fonstad's representation of the East is consistent with Tolkien's early maps. On the other hand, after 1960, Tolkien stated that men awoke much further east than the Elves, and that Cuiviénen must be fairly far west, near center of Endor. This later statement allows us to imagine a Middle-earth that extends much farther eastward indeed. In Fonstad's map, Cuiviénen is located some 2,000 miles east of Beligare. If we are to imagine the Elves awakening near the center of the continent, That would roughly quadruple the eastward extent of Middle-earth shown by Fonstad and Tolkien's early maps. The awakening of the first men in the east coincided with the rising of the sun, and while the sun first rose in the west, it would later rise in the east, and would continue to be a symbol for men, the so-called children of the sun. Another symbol of the east was the wild white kine that were still to be found near the Sea of Rhûn in the time of the steward Vorondil. Said in legend to be descended from the kine of Ara, these beasts must have been impressive, not only to Vorondil the hunter, but to the Easterlings, especially the chariot-riding Wainriders. They may have invested as much importance in these creatures as would the Indo-Europeans, also a steppe-dwelling chariot-riding people. Although the East was the location of men's awakening, it seems not to have been intended for their permanent home. Those who remained there were ensnared or intimidated by Morgoth and his servants. What kinship, if any, obtained between these earliest enemies of the West and the much later Wainriders is unclear. In Akallabeth, we learn that after the defeat of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, those of the evil men who were not destroyed fled back into the East, where many of their race were still wandering in the unharvested lands, wild and lawless, refusing alike the summons of the Valar and of Morgoth. And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings. These newcomers from the wars of Beleriand became the rulers of the ancient fatherland, but left to their own devices, they were not yet a threat to the Númenóreans. For the Dunedain became mighty in crafts, so that if they had had the mind, they could easily have surpassed the evil kings of Middle-earth in the making of war and the forging of weapons. And most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful. When the men of Westernesse began to share their arts with those of Middle-earth, knowledge of corn and wine, the sowing of seed and the grinding of grain, the hewing of wood and the shaping of stone and the ordering of their life, perhaps did not pass far inland from the western shores. Thus the men of the East would have needed to learn these things themselves from their westward neighbors or from others. Around the year 1800 of the Second Age, while the Númenóreans were beginning to establish lordships over the coasts, Sauron is said to extend his power eastwards. His goal in this period, his subtler plans having been undone in his war with the elves, was to become a king over all kings, and as a god unto men. In other words, to array beneath him the lesser kingships established by the evil men who had earlier fled into the East. 4 centuries later, this would begin to be accomplished through the 9 rings. 3 of these were given to great lords of Númenórean race. The allocation of the remaining 6 are not specified, save one. Khamûl the Easterling was likely not the only king of the East to be won over by one of the 9, but he was second only to the Witch King, Lord of the Nazgûl. Khamûl, the Shadow of the East, the Black Easterling, would later command Dol Guldur immediately prior to the War of the Ring as Sauron's lieutenant. Probably little or nothing of Khamûl's qualities can be extrapolated to Easterlings in general, but he is said to have been the most ready of all the Nazgûl, after the Black Captain himself, to perceive the presence of the ring, but also the one whose power was most confused and diminished by daylight. At first, upon receiving his ring, Khamûl and the others of the 9 became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth. Indeed, not only Khamûl benefited at first from Sauron's bestowal. In the east and south, well-nigh all men were under Sauron's dominion, and they grew strong in those days and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Whether the many towns and walls of stone were to be found in the east or in the south, or both, is unclear. The iron should not be read as a gift or bestowal from Sauron, however. We read that the Númenóreans earlier in the age were grieved to discover that iron was used against them by those to whom they had revealed it. Still, the impression of the above passage is that Sauron was intensely involved in forging these many peoples into civilizations powerful enough to threaten the men of Westernesse. Though his hegemony in Middle-earth would diminish with his defeat by the Númenóreans, Sauron would have left an imprint of his rule on the lands of the East. He also felt secure enough in the region to flee there, to the wastes of the East, rather than to the south, after the end of the Second Age. It is likely that even in this weakened state, he found servants in the east to serve him. When next we hear of him, 1,000 years into the Third Age, he comes to Dol Guldur. Sauron only surrendered his position there after 1,000 more years had passed, at which point he fled into the east again during the watchful peace of 2063 to 2460, before returning once more to southern Mirkwood. During the entire period of the Wainrider Wars with Gondor, then, Sauron remained in Dol Guldur, still in a weakened state. The wise suspect only in Third Age 2060 that the power of Dol Guldur is Sauron taking shape again. His time in the wastes of the east, although it lasted for a millennium, had already ended 800 years before the first Wainrider attacks on Rhovanion, and would only resume 100 years and more after the Battle of the Camp, in which the last Wainrider army sent against Gondor was destroyed. Echoes may have survived. The purported association of the East with the rising sun could, one imagines, be linked to some fire cult, if the description of Sauron's dwelling place is a guide. Indo-European myth links the motif of the sun to the eye and to the spoked wheel, a highly suggestive complex of images that would be ripe for exploitation by Sauron, and link him to the chariot-using Wainriders. And to be sure, the first Easterling attacks against Gondor in the Third Age could have been instigated by Sauron, but if so, they were poorly prepared for what they faced. And it is notable that the stronger and better armed Wainriders only arose at a time when Sauron's center of power was located hundreds of leagues to the west. We will return to the question of Sauron's involvement with the Wainriders in more detail. For now, we can suggest that his impact on their development is likely to have been limited and indirect. The geography of the East at any period is vague. There must have been mountains, for we hear of several houses of the dwarves establishing their mansions eastward, presumably beyond the Iron Hills. Otherwise, we get only impressions. If Hobbit lore can be a guide, there may have been deserts. Bilbo mentions the last desert in the east of East. In earlier drafts, Tolkien had Bilbo here referencing the Hindu Kush, the Great Desert of Gobi, and even the Chinese. But desert can simply mean waste, and nothing can be known of the wastes of the East apart from their apparent unsuitability for agriculture. During the Second Age, we read that everywhere outside Gil-galad's realm in Lindon, Sauron reigned, and those who would be free took refuge in the fastnesses of wood and mountain. This implies that the men in the East who lived under Sauron's dominion lived in the lowlands or plains. Certainly the fastnesses of wood and mountain would apply to the dwarves who dwelt in their mountain homes, the Northmen who clustered around the eaves of the Greenwood, and the elven realms in Lorien and the Greenwood itself, but nothing precludes the possibility of other such fastnesses being found further east. Remnants of Avari leading a wary existence in dark forests, bands of outlaws and free men living in the hills, and dwarven strongholds in far mountain ranges could all be imagined resisting the rising power of Sauron's servants, whose strength in the open lands was absolute. While the first chariots appear no sooner than the Wainriders themselves, at least in the Chronicles of Gondor, the sort of terrain here imagined for the East would be ideal for chariot warfare. And in fact, the rise of the chariot-riding Wainriders later in the Third Age itself implies that much of the eastern landscape was amenable to their particular mode of battle. Had large swaths of the East consisted of terrain too rough for their wheeled vehicles, the Wainriders would not have risen to such prominence. No doubt during the Wainrider period, fastnesses of wood and mountain remained to shelter those who would resist the dominance of the chariot warriors, but any such resistance did not seriously threaten the Wainriders themselves. Apparently the plains were the prize of the East. Denethor's much later reference to the far fields of Rhûn and the presence of wild kine living near the Sea of Rhûn support the impression of plains and grassland. Whether the many towns and walls of stone that were said to arise during Sauron's dominance were built in the East is unclear, but the apparently poor material culture of the later Second and early Third Age Easterlings, who are described as savage tribes and wild men respectively, suggests that they did not develop an urban, agriculture-based civilization analogous to those in Mesopotamia, or if they had, that its traces decayed swiftly. No signs of such a civilization are apparent in the brief references to the Wainriders' lands. We might then assume a vaguely Central Eurasian terrain for the lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn, but we will look in vain for military and political structures perfectly analogous to, say, the Mongol Empire. As we will see, the most noteworthy Easterling military development seems not to have been cavalry, but wheeled vehicles, the chariots and wagons that would give the later Wainriders their name. It was in the days of King Ostohair in the Third Age that Gondor was first attacked by wild men out of the east, but Terostar, his son, defeated them and drove them out and took the name of Romendakill, East Victor. He was, however, later slain in battle with fresh hordes of Easterlings. Turambar, his son, avenged him and won much territory eastwards. The Tale of Years in Appendix B allows us to add dates to these events. The first recorded Easterling invasion of Gondor occurred in Third Age 490, 2 years before Ostohair's apparently peaceful death. It is unclear precisely where this attack occurred, but no doubt it would have followed the same general course of all Easterling invasions, westward, through the broad lands between the arid Lithwi, Mirkwood, and the Sea of Rhûn. Since Gondor's winning of much territory eastwards would come later, we may suppose that the boundaries of the realm at the time of this first invasion ran down the Anduin to the Emyn Muil, and thence to the northwestern extremity of Mordor. Calenardon, the Green Province, as the land that would later become Rohan was then known, was certainly an early addition to Gondor's territory, as the fortresses of Aglarond and Angranost, and the north-south road that proceeded to Arnor, would have been important for communication between the two Dúnedainic kingdoms. This first assault of Wildmen, then, could have fallen at any point from, say, the Undeeps to North Ithilien. This first attack was by some measure a success. It would take 10 years for Gondor to strike back in Third Age 500 under Terostar Romendakill. During this time, the Easterlings must have established new homes or grazing lands in their conquered territory. It is clear at any rate that they were not mere looters, but intended to stay. As it was not enough for Romendakill to defeat them, he was obliged to drive them out of whatever land they had managed to wrest from Gondor's control. For reprisal to have taken so long, and for no further hostility to be mentioned, it seems most likely that this territory was somewhere fairly far from Gondor's chief cities at the lower stretch of the Anduin. Otherwise, we might have heard of attacks at Caer Andros or Osgiliath. Possibly, territory in northeastern Calenardon was the target of the Easterlings' invasion and the site of their decade-long occupation. Such a place would seem similar enough to the terrain they had originally come from, and allowed them to easily convert the new land to their use. After retaking this territory for Gondor, East Victor Romendakill met an ironic end some 40 years later in 541. These fresh hordes of Easterlings seem to have belonged to a different group from the original invaders. Since we are not told of Romendakill having conquered any new lands, it is probable that this second invasion occurred at around the same location as the first, somewhere south of Mirkwood. Whether this second assault was successful beyond the slaying of Romendakill is uncertain. It seems, though, that the battle was neither a decisive defeat nor a decisive victory for the Easterlings. We do not, for example, read of them needing to be driven away from Gondor's territory again, so it is unlikely that they occupied any lands. Turambar reigned for over 120 years after his father's death. It is during his reign that Gondor won much territory eastwards. It may also have been at this time that the road from the Morannon eastward, along the northern slopes of the arid Lithwi, was begun. It seems likely that this road, which remained unfinished, had been intended to speed Gondor's soldiers to meet the threat of an Easterling invasion. If so, it was ironic that in 1944 the final Wainrider assault would use this road to come unexpectedly upon Gondor's forces. Whether the vengeance for Romendakill's slaying occurred before or as part of Turambar's eastward conquest is not clear, but Turambar died peacefully in Third Age 667. By that time we can infer that Gondor's eastern boundary extended east to the inland Sea of Rhûn, as it is said to have done in the time of High Armendakill's reign some 3 centuries later. High Armendakill I, South Victor, whose given name was Kirieher, was not said to have fought the Easterlings, so presumably Turambar's campaign settled the eastern borders for a long time. More can be guessed about those borders. Since in High Armendakill's day the northern bounds of Gondor were located at the southern eaves of Mirkwood, we can assume that they did not extend toward the Celduin or river running. This would have left plenty of space for the development of the Northmen territories nearby. These Northmen had formerly been a numerous and powerful confederation of peoples living in the wide plains between Mirkwood and the river running, great breeders of horses and riders renowned for their skill and endurance, though their settled homes were in the eaves of the forest, and especially in the East Bight, which had largely been made by their felling of trees. This precise territory would correspond to the realm of the later ruler Vidugavia. Given the kinship and friendly relations that Gondor recognized between themselves and these Northmen, the kings would likely not have spent many resources guarding the line between southern Mirkwood and the Sea of Rhûn. They would have had greater interest in maintaining the watches over Mordor, which would require a presence at the Ered Lithwy, that is, until the Guard failed in Third Age 1640 following the Great Plague. Presumably, however, the gap between these mountains and the Sea of Rhûn would have been the primary focus of any patrols or defensive works, although no such structures are attested, for in the past the attacks of the Easterlings had come mostly over the plain between the Inland Sea and the Ash Mountains. The word "mostly" here is intriguing, suggesting an occasional alternative route of Easterling attack. What might have been the course of these other Easterling assaults? We can rule out attacks through the Harad. Attacks through Mordor against the fortresses that watched its northwestern borders may have occurred. The lands about the Sea of Nirnen are described as fertile, at least during the War of the Ring. But it would be a long journey for an army to march through the hostile plain of Gorgoroth toward passes that could easily be held by a few against many. The likeliest course for alternate Easterling attacks would seem to be across the lower Celduin, below its confluence with the Carnan. The upper Celduin, at any rate, seems to have served as a boundary against the later Wainrider expansion, allowing refugees to escape toward the region of Dale. But the lower parts of the river may have had crossings, and Easterlings could in theory have passed that way without much hindrance from the Northmen of Rhovanion, whose settled homes lay near the forest. It would be several more centuries before Turambar's borders would be tested, but when the next trial came, the borders were not actually guarded by soldiers from Gondor. At some point during the peace brought by the power of Gondor, the Northmen of Rhovanion were given wide lands beyond Anduin, south of Greenwood the Great, to be a defense against men of the East. The Northmen were thus given responsibility over the very lands through which the first Easterlings had attacked. It would be reasonable to place the granting of such a large territory during the reign of Etanatar II Alcaran the Glorious, son of Hyar Mendikil I, between 1149 and 1226. While Hyar Mendikil was a vigorous ruler, the waning of Gondor had already begun before Etanatar died. We read that he loved ease and did nothing to maintain the power that he inherited. While other circumstances may have motivated the decision, it seems well within his character to have handed custody of this important frontier to the Northmen. In the days of Etanatar's successor, Narmakil I, the Northmen take up a central role. Here we find the first, and indeed only, reference to conflict between the Northmen themselves and Gondor in this period. It was learned by the regent Menalkar that the Northmen did not always remain true to Gondor, and some would join forces with the Easterlings, either out of greed for spoil or in the furtherance of feuds among their princes. Interestingly, Faramir's discussion with Frodo, reported in the window on the west, suggests that hostile activity between the Northmen and Gondor was not in fact rare. He identifies the stewards as wiser than the kings of Gondor, in that they made a truce with the proud peoples of the north, who often had assailed us, men of fierce valor, but our kin from afar off, unlike the wild Easterlings or the cruel Haradrim. This truce seems to refer to the Treaty of Cirion and Eorl in Third Age 2510. Mardil, the first ruling steward, took up his rod of office almost 500 years earlier in 2050. No conflicts between Northmen and Gondor are recorded during the years of the stewards, or indeed at any time other than during Narmakil's day. Faramir's statement appears to suggest that those attacks continued, and it was only in the days of the stewards that they ceased. If so, we have no other clear evidence. It is very difficult, for example, to imagine the Eotheod, who were to prove so closely allied to the kings of Gondor during the Wainrider period, sending raids south into Calenardon. In any case, the limited Northman treachery during Narmakil's rule seems not to have taken the form of attacks on territory directly under Gondor's control. Otherwise, the attacks, and who was behind them, would be self-evident, and the identity of the participants would not need to be learned. We should then interpret these attacks as being directed against other Northmen, probably those south of Mirkwood in the province of Rhovanion that Gondor had granted. While this land was not apparently inhabited by men of Gondor, it was seen as crucial enough to the kingdom's borders that Minalcar needed to respond. We may indeed wonder whether Minalcar truly considered the Easterlings his main threat in the region. His chief concern, we are told, was with the Northmen, who had increased greatly in the peace brought by the power of Gondor. When the Easterling attacks began again in Minalcar's regency, they occurred at first with little force. At first implies that the force of the attacks would become greater, and indeed the Easterlings would later assemble a large army to face Minalcar. But one suspects that he had one eye upon the Northmen in this operation. After stating that the Northmen sometimes switched sides to join the invaders, the chronicler continues, Minalcar therefore in 1248 led out a great force, and between Rovanion and the inland sea he defeated a large army of the Easterlings. In the context of these passages, the therefore suggests not only that Minalcar sought to defeat the Easterlings, but to impress the Northmen upon his borders with a show of dominance in the region. No doubt the Easterlings were also impressed. As part of his campaign, Minalcar destroyed all their camps and settlements east of the sea. He then took the name of Romendikil. The geography here seems confused. East of the sea may be an error for west of the sea, but then it is not clear that settlements could have been established within the borders of the granted territory in such a short time. The attacks of the Easterlings that occasioned Minalcar's response began in the days of Narmakil, who took the throne in 1226. They would have had at most 22 years before Minalcar's campaign of 1248 to establish settlements in Gondor's trans-Anduin territory, which seems unlikely for attacks which, we are told, were conducted at first with little force. The apparently shifting nature of alliances between Northmen and Easterlings at this time would also seem to militate against the possibility of permanent settlement building west of the Sea of Rhûn. Do we then take the passage east of the sea as written? If so, it could be supposed that scribal hyperbole is at work. Minalcar's great force, strengthened with Northmen allies and meeting with great success, could conceivably have continued campaigning eastward of the sea, and destroyed all the settlements that he found there. One thinks of the campaigns of the Persian king Darius against the Scythians, another nomadic people living in a vast central steppe zone, which even the well-equipped army of a settled people would have extreme difficulty pinning down. The general of such an army, finding no more resistance from a withdrawing foe, might seek to mark a symbolic end to his campaign, and claim a victory which may have been in fact less total than he or the chroniclers believed. Regardless, wherever this destruction was accomplished, it was a decisive blow, not only winning battles and securing territory, but destroying infrastructure. On the other hand, the very success of the campaign may have contributed to the further animosity of the Easterlings. Especially if Minalcar's settlement burning in fact took place east of the inland sea, it may have entered into the folk history of the Easterlings, and seeded the development of political structures like a powerful chieftaincy that would be needed to face the threat of a strong Gondor. The 1248 campaign was conducted with the aid of Vidugavia, who called himself King of Rovanion, and was indeed the most powerful of the northern princes, though his own realm lay between Greenwood and the river Celduin. The identification of this large territory, which we have earlier seen described as the home of a numerous and powerful confederation of peoples, as Vidugavia's own realm, would certainly seem to show that Vidugavia wielded considerable wealth and power. On the other hand, lay between could indicate that his realm occupied only a portion of this territory. The former interpretation seems likelier, given what we know of the semi-nomadic nature of the Northmen of Rovanion and the large amount of space that would be needed for their herds. The description of Vidugavia's realm has implications for locating Minalcar's victory over the large army of Easterlings. Of chief concern in locating the battlefield is identifying what the chronicler means when he says that the battle took place between Rovanion and the inland sea. Rovanion, like Rhûn and Harad, does not have precise geographical boundaries, but the chronicler seems to find something strange in the earlier statement that Vidugavia called himself King of Rovanion, though his own realm lay between Greenwood and the river Celduin. For the chronicler, apparently, Rovanion's boundaries did not correspond to those of Vidugavia's territory, either because Rovanion comprised a much larger territory, or because the chronicler thought of Rovanion as constituting the gifted portion south of Mirkwood. If we center Rovanion along the eastern fringes of Greenwood, Minalcar's victory over the large army of Easterlings would have taken place somewhere northwest of the hills rising on the southwest shores of the inland sea. This would have been a convenient location for Vidugavia, who provided his support during the campaign, but on the other hand, this seems difficult to square with the typical path of Easterling invasion, and with Menalcar's destruction of settlements of the Easterlings which followed. Besides, the Northmen of Rovanion and the Eotheod and Rohirrim after them seem commonly to have traveled great distances in support of their allies. The open plains of Rovanion would not have been any obstacle to Vidugavia. Possibly, then, Rovanion is meant by the chronicler to indicate the southern gifted territory of the Northmen. This could place the battle on a line midway between the Sea of Rhûn and Mount Doom, perhaps at a similar location to battles fought by Turambar in his earlier campaigns eastward. Fighting and winning a decisive battle here would be a strong signal to the other local Northmen that Gondor was watching its eastern territories. What can we guess of the other northern princes that the chronicler mentions? The term prince no doubt reflects a desire to fit these vassals within the hierarchy of Gondor's overlordship. Vidugavia could call himself a king perhaps, since his lands were outside the territory granted by Gondor, but no northern prince living south of Mirkwood would make so bold a claim for himself. Maybe this very tension had fostered resentment among some of the Northmen occupying Gondor's granted lands, encouraging them to join forces with Easterling attackers and increase their own standing beyond the ceiling imposed by Gondor. The especial favor Romendikil II showed to Vidugavia would lead to a dynastic marriage between their houses and ultimately the kin strife begun in 1432. But the immediate wake of his campaign saw the securing of his borders in depth, and the securing of service from the Northmen who had been his chief concern at the outset of the campaign. On his return, Romendikil fortified the west shore of Anduin as far as the inflow of the Limelight, and forbade any stranger to pass down the river beyond the Emyn Muil. He it was that built the pillars of the Argonath at the entrance to Nen Hithoel. But since he needed men and desired to strengthen the bond between Gondor and the Northmen, he took many of them into his service, and gave to some high rank in his armies. In Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien notes the similarity of the known names of the Northmen of Rovanion to Gothic. Indeed, the resemblance passes beyond the linguistic into historical. Romendikil's need to impose stronger bonds of alliance upon a nearby people against a further enemy, his taking of these foreign men into his service, his fortification of a river border, all are reminiscent of the interactions between the Goths and the Romans in late antiquity. Regardless of its other consequences, Romendikil's policy resulted in the security of the eastern border established by Turambar. It would be 600 years before the Easterlings returned to the attack, but when they did, they would change the history of the Northmen and of Gondor forever. At the onset of the Wainriders' invasion, apart from the folk of Rovanion, Gondor had no other nearby allied people on whom to call for aid. Close to 2 millennia had passed since the last alliance, and since then the fortunes of men, especially those in the South Kingdom, had grown estranged from those of the elves. The Elven king Thranduil led his people further north into Mirkwood to escape the spreading influence of Dol Guldur. Something of the eastward borders of his realm at this time can be learned from the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. Thranduil's realm extended into the woods surrounding the Lonely Mountain and growing along the west shores of the Long Lake before the coming of the dwarves exiled from Moria and the invasion of the dragon. It is interesting to consider how the contours of his realm would have changed with the coming of these dwarves in Third Age 1999. The statement in The Hobbit that the Elven King had acquired wine from Dorwinion, a land near the outflow of the Celduin into the Sea of Rhûn, indicates that by the last centuries of the Third Age, commerce flowed the length of the river. It is possible, but uncertain, that folk lived in Dorwinion during the Wainrider period. To the agents of Gondor, the state of peoples and trade east of the Anduin at this time was largely unknowable, but if trade had existed along the Celduin prior to the Wainrider invasion, it was likely interrupted to some degree by the newcomers. Thranduil would probably need to wait until the prosperity brought by the kingdom under the mountain before linking his realm reliably with the outside world. And the troubles of the Northmen and people of Gondor, though they would have evoked Thranduil's pity, must have seemed beyond his powers to prevent. Only in the Battle of the Five Armies would the Elven King again lead a host of his people beyond their borders. Lorien offers 2 separate and irreconcilable traditions regarding its leadership during the Wainrider period. However, the uncertainty here is irrelevant for our purposes, since in no tradition did Elves of Lorien play a role in the Wainrider invasions or related conflicts. Lorien seems to have been mostly isolated for many centuries, with their nearest excursion to our period coming in Third Age 1409, when Elrond brought help over the mountains out of Lorien to aid the North Kingdom against Angmar. This campaign, in fact, marks the last known military action coordinated between the elves of Lindon, Rivendell, and Lorien, and it seems to have been effective. Clearly the bonds of kinship and alliance continued to unite these elven enclaves for the coming centuries. Although Angmar succeeded in capturing Rhudaur and devastating Cardolan, Arthedain and the line of kings remained, and Angmar itself was subdued by the elven folk, apparently for some 500 years, until near the end of the Wainrider conflict. We are told that Angmar renewed its attack upon Arthedain at the same time as the Wainriders reappeared in great force in 1944. Still, we should not interpret this long-lasting elven success as offering anything more than a wary stalemate to the region. It would take forces from Gondor to utterly destroy the threat of Angmar, and in the end, the kingdom of Arthedain would fall, and the northern Dunedain become a wandering, dispossessed people. Rising around Third Age 1350, Angmar comprised not only evil men, but also orcs and other fell creatures. The sole purpose of its ruler, the Witch King, chief of the Ringwraiths, was destroying the Dunedain in Arnor, who had splintered into the three lesser kingdoms of Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur after Third Age 861. For most of its existence, Angmar seems only to have had just sufficient strength to pose a threat to these successor states, often employing treachery and sorcery to achieve its aims. The fall of Rhudaur was accomplished via an evil lord of the Hillmen, presumably representing a native population related to the Brelanders, Dunlendings, and Men of the Mountains, against whom Minas Anor had long ago been raised as a shield against the wild men of the Dales. These Hillmen were in secret league with Angmar, but when some 50 years later it is reported that the Tower of Amon-Sul was burned and razed and Rhudaur was occupied by evil men subject to Angmar, it seems that these evil men are distinct from the Hillmen, and more directly under the Witch King's sway. After the Great Plague in 1636, evil spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur occupied the Barrow Downs, marking an end to the Dunedain of Cardolan. As for Arthedain itself, the years from 1851 to 1944 would seem to have been fairly stable, though in the event it proved only a calm before the storm. Though Rhudaur was wholly subject to Angmar and Cardolan had been destroyed centuries before, Arthedain maintained strong enough relations with Círdan's folk of Lindon, and through him Elrond and Rivendell, to expect their aid. Hobbits dwelt in the land that would later be called the Shire, with the blessing of the king. The desolation of Cardolan and the threat of Angmar would have kept Arthedain focused east and north rather than south. In the lands between the rivers Brandywine and Angren, later Isen, nothing sure is known from this period. The native population of the coasts and woodlands to either side of the Grey Flood was hostile to the Númenóreans in the Second Age. These people were fairly numerous and warlike, but they were forest dwellers, scattered communities without central leadership, who attacked and ambushed the Númenóreans once the latter began their extensive program of tree felling in the region. They seem distinct from the dark men out of the mountains who, in the latter days of Tar Aldarion in the Second Age, were thrusting into Enedwaith. No doubt these dark men were the ancestors of the Dunlendings. There are also hints of some interactions with people of a different sort in the region. In the days of the kings, we read that in the marshlands of the mouths of Grey Flood and Isen lived a few tribes of wild men, fishers and fowlers, but akin in race and speech to the Druidine of the woods of Anorion. A link between these coastal folk and the Druidine is nowhere else indicated. However, ever since the days of Sauron's destruction of Eregion, the peoples of Enedwaith seem not to have been involved in any major conflicts. Since the Great Plague of the year 1636 of the Third Age, Minhiriath had been almost entirely deserted, though a few secretive hunter folk lived in the woods. In Enedwaith, the remnants of the Dunlendings lived in the east, in the foothills of the Misty Mountains, and a fairly numerous but barbarous fisher folk dwelt between the mouths of the Gwathlo and the Angren, or Isen. Not that the Dunedain offered them any resistance. Enedwaith had never been strongly occupied by either the North or the South Kingdom, and apart from the north-south road linking the realms and the Great Bridge at Tharbad, interest in the region seems to have been non-existent. Tharbad would swiftly decline as a settlement after the Great Plague, until long before the time of the Lord of the Rings it had gone back into wild fenlands. Long before is vague, but we learn of the Bridge of Tharbad becoming ruinous in the period 1975 to 2050, when the days of the kings ended, that is, after the end of the Wainrider Wars. Tharbad, then, must have served in some diminished capacity as a crossing until then. Diminished because the idea of an active, garrisoned settlement so close to Eriador seems contrary to what we know of the course of the Angmar Wars. No record of reinforcements from Tharbad or defense of the river port itself survives, giving the impression of a settlement that, like Osgiliath, simply dwindled in population until it was abandoned after the Wainrider period and the destruction of the North Kingdom. As for the Dunlendings, or more precisely their ancestors, there is a pattern of gradual but constant pressure eastward against the Angren, which served as the northern boundary of Gondor's territory. During the Watchful Peace from 2063 to 2460, we read of Dunlendings drifting steadily and unchecked over the Isen, contributing to the mixed blood of a population subject to local hereditary chieftains of Gondor who were in charge of forts such as at Aglarond and Angrenost, later Isengard. While this population pressure is described as occurring after the Wainrider period, it may be suggested that the process had begun somewhat earlier, following the days of the Great Plague. The Dunlendings are said to have suffered less than most in this calamity, which would have allowed them to begin filling the vacuum left by Gondor in the region, as the kingdom's attention was drawn eastward by the Wainriders. In any case, the story of the Upper Angren in this period is of increasing autonomy from the kings and later stewards. Gondor itself in Third Age 1851 was already a lesser realm, compared to the heights of its power around 800 years prior. In the days of High Armendikel I, Gondor ruled over a territory stretching from Umbar to Angrenost to the Sea of Rhûn. But in the centuries since, Sauron invasion, civil war, and plague had forced the South Kingdom into more modest dimensions. The heartland of Gondor itself had seen blood shed in the kinstrife, which led to the carving out of an independent Corsair realm centered on Umbar, far south along the coast. While Umbar itself was briefly retaken in 1810, it would soon be lost again, and the land of South Gondor between the Poros and Harnan rivers was no longer friendly territory. East of Anduin, the Northmen of Rhovanion watched the marches of a territory that was, thanks to the openness of the terrain, a main avenue of assault from the east. But the Northmen had suffered during the Great Plague, which appeared in Rhovanion in the winter of the year 1635 and soon spread to Gondor. In Gondor, the mortality was great, especially among those who dwelt in cities. It was greater in Rhovanion, for though its people lived mostly in the open and had no great cities, the plague came with a cold winter when horses and men were driven into shelter and their low wooden houses and stables were thronged. Moreover, they were little skilled in the arts of healing and medicine, of which much was still known in Gondor, preserved from the wisdom of Númenor. When the plague passed, it is said that more than half of the folk of Rhovanion had perished, and of their horses also. They were slow to recover, but their weakness was not tested for a long time. We can perhaps glean a little about the society of the Wainriders from this information. For the Wainriders, or their progenitors, the people further east, to have been equally afflicted by the plague, as we are told they no doubt were, they may have lived in a similar fashion to the folk of Rhovanion, mostly in the open, but having been driven into shelter of some kind. Certainly no cities are reported in the brief annals of Gondor's expeditions into the east. In the days of Armendikel I, the first Easterlings to have contacted Gondor were called simply Wild Men out of the East. Turambar won much territory eastwards, but no cities are noted, and in 1248 Minalcar found camps and settlements. It seems clear that whatever the size, complexity, or permanence of the settlements, they are not to be compared with cities of Gondor. Still, however they had suffered in the plague, the Easterlings would recover more swiftly than their rivals, and would strike a decisive blow. The Wainriders were counted as the third great evil of Gondor. In the Annals of the Kings and Rulers, Appendix A, their appearance is described as follows. The third evil was the invasion of the Wainriders, which sapped the waning strength of Gondor in wars that lasted for almost 100 years. The Wainriders were a people, or a confederacy of many peoples, that came from the east, but they were stronger and better armed than any that had appeared before. They journeyed in great wains, and their chieftains fought in chariots. Stirred up, as was afterwards seen by the emissaries of Sauron, they made a sudden assault upon Gondor, and King Narmekil II was slain in battle with them beyond Anduin in 1856. The people of eastern and southern Rhovanion were enslaved, and the frontiers of Gondor were, for that time, withdrawn to the Anduin and the Emyn Muil. The chronicler's uncertainty about the Wainriders' ethnic makeup is interesting. While they came from the east and will be referred to by the generic term Easterlings in other records, they are distinct from their predecessors, and apparently from each other. The chronicler first calls them a people, but immediately reconsiders, or a confederacy of many peoples. Something about the Wainriders led observers to think they were not all members of a single, unified group. Since the speech of the Easterlings seems never to have been learned in Gondor, the differences between these peoples would have involved appearance, perhaps in dress or bodily decoration or arms. Whatever it was, the difference must have been great for a witness from Gondor to note it. Together with the statement in the Tale of Years that the attacks of the Wainriders upon Gondor began in 1851, we can see that it took 5 years for Narmekil II to meet them in battle. This seems excessive. Surely one purpose of the Northmen bulwark in Rhovanion was to provide intelligence to Gondor in the event of invasion. Maybe the first attacks were so swift and effective that news of them only slowly spread to the other Northman settlements, or perhaps politics in Rhovanion played a role. We have already seen how, some 600 years before, some Northmen were known to align themselves with Easterling invaders for their own purposes. But assuming that the Northmen proved true and quickly sent word to the king, what can account for such a delay in assembling a response? A century later, when King Eärnil received word of the dangers besetting Arthedain in the north, relief troops were in Lindon within 2 years, having traveled a much longer distance to aid a realm that was not their own. In 1851, Narmekil II had been on the throne scarcely a year. Telumethar Umbardakil had died in 1850, 40 years after retaking Umbar. We hear of no other conflicts during Telumethar's reign, but we are told that Gondor's occupation of Umbar would not last long. While there seemed to have been no active wars in the south, Gondor's military would likely have been oriented toward that theater, providing lines of supply, engaging any remnant corsair presence, and generally securing its interests. Additionally, Telumethar's retaking of Umbar is one rare uptick in a narrative of general decline since the days of Hyar-Mendikil I. The kinstrife, the Great Plague, and the decadence or indolence of several kings all took their toll on the readiness of Gondor's military. The names Hyar-Mendikil, South Victor, and Ro-Mendikil, East Victor, are themselves reflective of the expansive claims Gondor was making in earlier centuries. Against these grand titles, Umbardakil is much more modest. Like his conquest of Umbar, Telumethar's successor would be short-lived. Narmekil II would only reign for 6 years, perhaps several of those spent drawing troops north to face the new Easterling menace. The description of this campaign in Cirion and Eorl adds some detail to the account in Appendix A. The Northmen bore the brunt of the first assaults. King Narmekil II took a great army north into the plains south of Mirkwood and gathered all that he could of the scattered remnants of the Northmen, but he was defeated and himself fell in battle. The remnant of his army retreated over the Daggerlight into Ithilien, and Gondor abandoned all lands east of the Anduin save Ithilien. The king's gathering all that he could of the scattered remnants of the Northmen added to his already great army, but evidently these numbers were not enough. It is not clear whether this great army, together with the Northmen, was comparable to the great force that saw such victory under Minalcar, but if so, it is an indication of the strength of the Wainriders that this army was defeated so decisively. The only other defeat suffered by a king of Gondor at the hands of Easterlings was that of Remendikil I in 541. That had required hordes of Easterlings, whereas Remendikil's army was of an unknown size. Significantly, the Wainriders' numbers are not emphasized in the Battle of 1856. While they are described as stronger than other Easterlings, this could refer to physical strength, prowess, or even morale in addition to quantity of warriors. The chroniclers do not attempt to salvage Gondor's honor by claiming that its king was hopelessly outnumbered. It could be, then, that in 1856 Narmakil II was facing an enemy of roughly equal numbers to his own. In addition to being stronger than other Easterlings, the Wainriders were also better armed than any that had appeared before. Better armed is plain enough, but since we know nothing of the armaments of previous invaders from the east, this information is of little use even in a relative sense. We can discount any new metallurgical developments. Iron had been known to them since the dark years of the Second Age. The one piece of positive information we have is that the Wainriders, at least their chieftains, used chariots in battle, but it is not certain whether the chariots themselves were the cause of their unexpected strength. The chariots of the Wainriders are nowhere described, but we will see that in a later battle, in 1944, Wainrider chariots were used alongside cavalry as a shock unit to great effect against Gondor's disordered line. However, the idea of such a charge bringing this battle to a swift conclusion can be rejected. There is no evidence that Narmakil's army was surprised. He had had 5 years to prepare, and in his advance toward the enemy, took his time to gather remnants of the Northmen. We may imagine this battle opened in a fairly deliberate fashion, each side having time to assemble, measure the strength of the other, and then advance. While the Wainriders' strength may have been in part due to their chariots, they would also have had a significant infantry element. In some historical battles, such as at Kadesh or Megiddo, chariots were estimated to make up 1/10 or less of an armed force, with infantry making up the vast majority. But while better armed than other Easterlings, these infantry probably were still less heavily armored than many soldiers of Gondor. What this cost them in defense, it may have made up for in flexibility. The chariots in this battle could have been well supported by horsemen or infantry light enough to keep up, and the battle took place in open enough territory for outflanking and other maneuvers that would allow the Wainriders to use the tactics to which they were accustomed. The enemy's wains, from the perspective of Gondor a new piece of technology like the chariots, were primarily for travel and temporary defense while on the move, but they may have played a role in this battle as well. As we have seen, the Wainriders spent the first 5 years of their invasion fighting Northmen in Rhovanion. Against these horsemen, the ability to quickly set up a defensive encampment by circling their wains would have been valuable. One can imagine a scenario in which the Wainriders set up just such a defensive position prior to their engagement with the army of Gondor. Narmakil's forces could have been long held up by the warriors defending the encampment of circled wains, while more mobile troops outflanked. Something of the course of battles involving a wagon logger can be learned from the example of the Battle of Adrianople, in which the Goths held their defensive circle of wagons until their cavalry could attack the Romans in the flank. No doubt the Goths had learned this tactic from the steppe peoples they lived alongside. The earlier Scythians used wagons, and as we have seen, the Huns did as well. A Hunnic example occurs in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where Attila was said at one point to retreat to his wagons. Gondor's native forces would have comprised mostly infantry. Partly this may have been due to continuation of Númenórean practice. That this was almost always the case can also be seen from the evidence of later battles, which saw Gondor rely on riders from other peoples. In the Battle of 1856, the Northmen provided the only known cavalry element, the horsemen of the Northmen under Marhari, who acted as a rearguard. But unlike in later battles, we do not hear of Gondor's army executing a great flanking maneuver with its allied cavalry. While the location of the Battle of 1856 is identified as having been between Mirkwood and Dagorlad, the course of the battle itself is unclear. If the later Battle of 1944 can be a guide, a charge from the chariots could have opened up the fight. This was apparently unable to break Gondor's army. If many of the chieftains of the Wainriders who fought in those vehicles were slain in this first attempt, the loss of leadership would have contributed to the stalling of the Wainriders' invasion, which chroniclers observe after the battle itself. Following the repulse of the chariots, Narmakil's forces may then have advanced toward the camp of circled wains. In turn, unable to overrun the Wainriders' position, the army of Gondor may have been surrounded by lighter, more mobile troops and driven to withdraw. Of course, this is speculation. We do not know how the king was killed or whether it was he who ordered the retreat. What is known is that casualties to both sides were great. Though they were the victors, the Wainriders were somewhat checked. The forces of Gondor had inflicted such losses on the Wainriders that they had not strength enough to press their invasion until reinforced from the east, and were content for the time to complete their conquest of Rhovanion. Despite the disastrous losses for Gondor and the damage dealt to the Wainriders, the end of the battle seems to have involved a careful disengagement. The surviving forces of Gondor retreated over the Dagorlad into Ithilien. It was not a rout. How this was accomplished is described in a note to Cirion and Eorl, where we simultaneously learn the manner of fighting of the Northmen at the time, which is in keeping with what we are told of these people in the centuries before. The escape of the army of Gondor from total destruction was in part due to the courage and loyalty of the horsemen of the Northmen under Marhari, a descendant of Vidugavia, king of Rhovanion, who acted as a rearguard. We do not know what other role Northmen played in the battle, whether Marhari's cavalry had been intended as a rearguard from the beginning and was held in reserve for this purpose, or if they acted in that capacity in the absence of any other options. Regardless, the cavalry of the Northmen continued to play decisive roles in the Wainrider conflict, and indeed beyond, as the rides of Eorl and Theoden would prove. Their presence in this battle, where so little else is stated, in turn reinforces the picture of Gondor's strength lying rather in infantry. We do not know in what manner Narmekil II met his end, but in the final battle with the Wainriders upon Dagorlad in 1944, the King of Gondor died on his feet. The events of 1851 to 1856 were no doubt a shock to Gondor, but one may question what the Wainriders had planned. In several ways, their movements appear to have been more of an uncoordinated migration than an invasion. The statement that they journeyed in great wains suggests a people on the move, not a strictly military operation, although the distinction between the two may have seemed moot to the Northmen. In the following decades, we will see that the Wainriders' families, including women, children, and the elderly, lived with them in their newly won lands, which they seemed to regard not merely as the staging point for an invasion of Gondor proper, but as their homes which they defended fiercely. We get the impression that these families accompanied the warriors in 1851. Certainly the Wainriders' movements before the Battle of the Plains do not suggest that their primary aim was an invasion and overthrow of Gondor's lands. They were in Rhovanion for 5 years. No doubt the Northmen put up a stout defense, but it is also likely that what Gondor eventually became aware of, and tried but failed to prevent, was a land-taking in Rhovanion. In 5 years, the Wainriders got no closer to Gondor than the plains south of Mirkwood. We might suppose that the moves they made following their victory, completing their conquest of Rhovanion, were not solely forced upon them by losses inflicted by Narmekil's army. For the Wainriders involved in the movements of 1851, they found in Rhovanion lands that they were all too happy to make their own. The fact that the Wainriders had not only swept aside Gondor's bulwark in Rhovanion, but also defeated the great army of its king, shows that they represented a threat of a different order. The successful invasion of 1851 to 1856 would have long-lasting impacts for the Wainriders themselves, as well as for the surrounding peoples of Middle-earth. While the Wainriders would suffer defeat in the coming years, the territory they had taken would in fact never be reconquered by Gondor. Even following Gondor's victories of 1899 and 1944, there would be some Easterling presence in the area. The Balcoth of Third Age 2510 inhabited precisely this region and exhibited a similar use of wains. But while the accounts of the invasion describe an occupation of all the former lands of the Northmen of Rhovanion and the reduction to servitude of those Northmen who did not flee, survival of some independent Northmen in the area is indicated by a reference to the much later stewardship of Cirion, when new and dangerous enemies were coming out of the east and steadily drifting in from beyond the Sea of Rhûn. They were slaying or driving north up the river Running and into the forest the remnant of the Northmen, friends of Gondor, that still dwelt east of Mirkwood. Since this episode takes place more than 500 years after Gondor's last battle with the Wainriders, we could suppose that in the apparent dearth of Easterling activity since, Northmen had crept back, either through the forest or down from the north, in an attempt to repopulate the old heartland of Vidugavia's realm. But movement through Mirkwood at this time seems unlikely. On the other side of the forest, Northmen had relocated up to the sources of the Anduin in 1977 in order to avoid the growing threat of Dol Guldur. While Sauron had been driven out of that stronghold in 2063, he returned with increased strength in 2460, almost 30 years prior to the start of Cirion's stewardship. It is not impossible to imagine some Northmen having made the trek through the forest earlier, during the Watchful Peace, but we are told of no such movements. Movement southward seems more likely. Erebor was first founded in Third Age 1999, and if the dwarves of the mountain aided or traded with the local Northmen, some of whom were descended from refugees fleeing the first Wainrider invasion, the Northmen could have felt strong enough to attempt settlements south of the Celduin after the Wainrider menace had receded. However, the words remnant and still dwelt suggest that some Northmen had survived the Wainrider invasion and were somehow able to continue living in their old territory, maintaining their identity separate from the occupiers. This is possible to conceive if the Wainriders did not attempt to eradicate the Northmen as a people, and indeed the Wainriders' own existence as a confederacy of many peoples could well indicate a habit of leaving conquered folk mostly to their own affairs, in their own communities, so long as these subjugated folk paid tribute in slaves or goods. Still, for these subjugated Northmen to be called Friends of Gondor, one would suppose them to have taken part in the slave revolt of 1899, in which, as we will see, most of the rebelling slaves are said to have perished. Most is not all, but it is difficult to imagine how Northmen loyal to Gondor could have survived east of Mirkwood, especially if they had participated in a failed slave revolt. Possibly the chronicler of Cirion and Eorl was overly optimistic in his assessment of the Northmen's loyalty, and they represented a group that had come to exist under the thumb of the Wainriders before being driven away north by the newly arrived Balcoth. Whatever the case, the Northmen of the region indeed bore the brunt of the first Wainrider assaults, but those who survived and were not enslaved would go on to form new peoples that would be of significance centuries later. In the aftermath of the Wainrider invasion, as for the Northmen, a few, it is said, fled over the Celduin, river running, and were merged with the folk of Dale under Erebor, with whom they were akin. Some took refuge in Gondor, and others were gathered by Marhuini, son of Marhari, who fell in the rearguard action after the Battle of the Plains. Passing north between Mirkwood and Anduin, they settled in the Vales of Anduin, where they were joined by many fugitives who came through the forest. This was the beginning of the Eotheod, though nothing was known of it in Gondor for many years. Most of the Northmen were reduced to servitude, and all their former lands were occupied by the Wainriders. That some of the Northmen took refuge in Gondor is unsurprising, given the long history of alliance between their peoples. We know that as late as Third Age 1974, these men made up a distinct element in Gondor's forces, fighting as far afield as the North Downs. In that year, Gondor sent a fleet north to the belated aid of Arthedain, which had just fallen to the power of the Witch King of Angmar. Of that force, most of all the horses were praised, for many of them came from the Vales of Anduin, and with them were riders tall and fair, and proud princes of Rhovanion. Indeed, the cavalry of the Northmen would play a decisive role in the defeat and rout of Angmar, as it would in so many other battles in the Third Age. To return to the survivors of Rhovanion, we can learn of the others gathered by Marhuini that they were at this time a small people living in the Vales of Anduin between the Carrock and the Gladden fields, for the most part on the west side of the river. While these folk may seem destined for a desperate survival in a much reduced territory, we will see that they show a surprising tenacity, being involved in all the major conflicts with the Wainriders, and indeed instigating a largely successful campaign against them just decades after their near annihilation. The Northmen who fled over the Celduin and were merged with the folk of Dale under Erebor require some digression. In A Tale of Years, Dale is only mentioned in the context of its destruction by Smaug in Third Age 2770, and no date is given for its founding. That must be inferred from Thorin's statement in The Hobbit that the merry town of Dale was built in Thror's day, after Third Age 2590. The Kingdom of the Mountain was founded earlier in 1999, but still after the Wainrider period. How then do we reconcile this mention of Dale and Erebor around Third Age 1856 with these other statements? Both dwarves and men had certainly been living in the region for millennia. The essay Of Dwarves and Men in Peoples of Middle-earth describes a fascinating period of contact and cooperation between the races dating back to the very earliest times. This essay offers a detailed description of the boundaries of the territory of the Longbeards in the First Age during the War of the Jewels. The Longbeards had spread southward down the Vales of Anduin and had made their chief mansion and stronghold at Moria, and also eastward to the Iron Hills, where the mines were their chief source of iron ore. They regarded the Iron Hills, the arid Mithrin, and the east dales of the Misty Mountains as their own land. The absence of Erebor here is notable. In fact, it does not feature in the histories until Third Age 1999, when Thrain I founds the kingdom under the mountain. This is remarkable considering the importance ascribed to the Iron Hills and the traffic between the extreme northeastern bounds of the Longbeard realm and the other territories that would have passed within sight of Erebor. It seems that the abandonment of Moria following the emergence of the Balrog in Third Age 1980 provided the necessary impetus for the Longbeards to search for a new location for their chief mansion and stronghold. At the time of the Wainriders, then, Erebor was not the great dwarven settlement it would later become. While some minor delving operations cannot be ruled out, its wooded slopes and surrounding forests seem to have been held by Thranduil, or at least near his territory, as we have seen. The Iron Hills themselves, having been cut off from Moria since the middle of the Second Age, likely continued as an independent dwarven realm, as suggested by the title Lord used by Dain in the time of the Hobbit. But in the First Age, the migration of men from the east and south had brought advanced guards into Beleriand, but they were not in great numbers, though further east in Eriador and Rovanion, especially in the northern parts, their kindred must already have occupied much of the land. There, dealings between men and the Longbeards must soon have begun. For the Longbeards, though the proudest of the seven kindreds, were also the wisest and the most far-seeing. Men held them in awe, and were eager to learn from them, and the Longbeards were very willing to use men for their own purposes. Thus there grew up in those regions the economy, later characteristic of the dealings of dwarves and men, including hobbits. Men became the chief providers of food as herdsmen, shepherds, and land-tillers, which the dwarves exchanged for work as builders, road-makers, miners, and the makers of things of craft, from useful tools to weapons and arms and many other things of great skill. To the great profit of the dwarves, the chief advantage to them was their freedom to proceed unhindered with their own work and to refine their arts, especially in metallurgy, to the marvelous skill which these reached before the decline and dwindling of the Khazad. For men, too, the relationship was a valuable one. They were glad of the alliance, for they were more vulnerable to the attacks of the orcs. They dwelt largely in scattered homesteads and villages, and if they drew together into small townships they were poorly defended, at best by dikes and wooden fences. Also they were lightly armed, chiefly with bows, for they had little metal and the few smiths among them had no great skill. These things the dwarves amended in return for one great service that men could offer. They were tamers of beasts and had learned the mastery of horses, and many were skilled and fearless riders. These would often ride far afield as scouts and keep watch on movements of their enemies, and if the orcs dared to assemble in the open for some great raid, they would gather great force of horsed archers to surround them and destroy them. In these ways the alliance of dwarves and men in the north came early in the Second Age to command great strength, swift in attack, and valiant and well protected in defense, and there grew up in the region between dwarves and men respect and esteem, and sometimes warm friendship. The description of the fearless riders is, of course, reminiscent of the much later similar talents of the Northmen of Rovanion, the Eotheod, and the Rohirrim. The description of scattered homesteads and villages likewise recalls the way of life of the men of Rovanion during the time of the Great Plague of Third Age 1635, and which no doubt continued to hold until the conquest of the Wainriders 2 centuries later. Thus we can safely assume continuity of culture of men in the region from the very earliest times. Although the alliance of dwarves and men in the north would be destroyed in the Second Age, 1695, when Sauron's destruction of Eregion would lead to the isolation of Moria from the outside world, men must have continued to live throughout the Anduin Vales and around the northern and eastern borders of Mirkwood. It stands to reason, too, that the lands along the Kelduin and the Long Lake would have been desirable for the feeding and watering of the herds that were the Northmen's livelihood. Indeed, at several points throughout the histories, we see that the Kelduin and Carnan rivers seem to have served as boundaries, limits to the expansion of hostile folk from the east. The ability of the Northmen of Rhovanion to flee from the Wainriders over the Celduin, where they could merge with other folk, presumably in relative peace, is one such example. Another can be found in the War of the Ring, when Easterling allies of Sauron that had long threatened the borders of King Brand crossed the river Carnan, presumably into his territory. Taken together, these references suggest that the Celduin and Carnan, even in the earlier Wainrider period, served as a barrier or at least obstacle to invaders from the east, allowing the Northmen to seek refuge across them and perhaps even to flourish. We can speculate that since Longbeard dwarves had dwelt continuously in the Iron Hills since the First Age and throughout our period, these may, following the example of their ancestors earlier in the Second Age, have formed some contact and perhaps even loose league or alliance with these groups of Northmen, although no major clashes between these peoples and the Wainriders are recorded. Khazad-dûm had of course been largely isolated ever since the destruction of Eregion in the Second Age. The separation of this chief mansion from its tributary regions must have been a catastrophic shock to the Longbeards, only outdone by the abandonment of Moria itself in Third Age 1981. After that, records suggest a recolonization effort rather than a re-establishment of contact with sundered kin. Thorin I found the Grey Mountains rich but little explored as late as 2210. While there may have been Longbeards in the Grey Mountains prior to Thorin's arrival, they seem to have been few, or not closely associated with the direct heirs of Durin. This may have been due to the several increases of orcs in northern Middle-earth that we read of in the later Second and Third Age. After the fall of Eregion and the isolation of Moria, the orcs, reinforced and commanded by servants of Sauron, invaded the mountains again. Gundabad was retaken, the arid Mithrin infested, and the communication between Moria and the Iron Hills for a time cut off. We know of no retaking of either Gundabad or the Grey Mountains until after the Wainrider Wars. Closer to our period, the entry in the Tale of Years for around 1300 states, "Evil things begin to multiply again. Orcs increase in the Misty Mountains and attack the dwarves. The Nazgul reappear. The chief of these comes north to Angmar." Khazad-dûm was invulnerable to attack from without, but any other Longbeard mansions would have been hard put to it to survive. The only Longbeard province that we know to have endured outside of Moria is the Iron Hills. But the Longbeards were likely not the only dwarves on the periphery of the Wainriders' realm. Quenta Silmarillion also gives this information. In ancient days the Naugrim dwelt in many mountains of Middle-earth, and there they met mortal men, they say, long ere the Eldar knew them, whence it comes that of the tongues of the Easterlings many show kinship with dwarf speech rather than with the speeches of the elves. Nowhere else is contact between dwarves and Easterlings so clearly stated. The reference to many mountains in connection with the Easterlings implies that other ranges than those identified on the published map of Middle-earth were the homes of the dwarves who made these contacts, no doubt mountain ranges further east in the lands of Rhûn. Dwarves dwelling in such places would likely belong to other houses than those known in the west. All that is known of these other houses is that the place of their awakening was eastward, at distances as great or greater than that between the Blue Mountains and Gundabad. However, despite these distances, the dwarves of different kindreds were in communication, and in the early ages often held assemblies of delegates at Mount Gundabad. In times of great need, even the most distant would send help to any of their people, as was the case in the Great War against the orcs. Some form of commerce between these easterly houses and their relatives in the west would have occurred then in the earlier Wainrider period. On the other hand, despite the willingness to aid their distant kindred, conflict between the dwarves themselves was not unheard of. A warlike race of old were all the Naugrim, and they would fight fiercely against whomsoever aggrieved them, servants of Melkor, or Eldar, or Avari, or wild beasts, or not seldom their own kin, dwarves of other mansions and lordships. Eastern dwarves were also not necessarily free from the influence of the shadow. Some of the earliest contacts between men and dwarves were marked by just this suspicion. Men of the House of Hador at first had regarded the dwarves askance, fearing that they were under the shadow, as they said. Alas, it seems probable that, as men did later, the dwarves of the far eastern mansions, and some of the nearer ones, came under the shadow of Morgoth and turned to evil. That this was in fact the case is confirmed by the statement that, in the War of the Last Alliance, All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. In any case, the involvement of these eastern dwarves in the wars of the dwarves and orcs in the later Third Age is the last we hear of them in the western lands. If cooperation between dwarves and Nen of the sort described in Peoples of Middle-earth was actually common, we could imagine exchanges of various sorts occurring between the eastern dwarves and the Easterlings. Alliances similar to that of the Longbeards and the Northmen, feuds similar to that between Fram and the dwarves over the dragon Scatha's hoard, and no doubt at least some of the many wars that are hinted at occurring in the east beyond the reach of Gondor would have involved these dwarves as well. Whether all or only some of them turned wholly to evil is unknowable, but their influence on the men of the east, as the histories of the elves were bound up with the fate of the men of the west, could have been significant. The sudden emergence of the Wainriders, their successful assault and occupation of Rhovanion, and the abandonment of the latter by the forces and allies of Gondor must have come as a shock, a massive military setback, entirely unexpected. However, Gondor and the Northmen would soon show that they were capable of striking back. The blow came in the reign of King Narmakil II's son, Kalimetar. The chroniclers identify Kalimetar as being free from other dangers, and thus able to turn his thoughts to vengeance for the defeat and death of his father. We are told that Kalimetar's grandfather, Telumetar, had captured Umbar and broken the power of the Corsairs, and the peoples of Harad were at this period engaged in wars and feuds of their own. Umbar's retaking occurred decades prior to the Wainrider invasion in 1810, and marks an unusual period of Gondorian resurgence in the south. Ever since the close of the Kinstrife in 1448, Umbar had provided refuge to potential claimants to Gondor's throne, and no doubt threatened Gondor's shipping and coasts. While we have little information about the nature and scope of conflicts between Umbar and Gondor throughout their long history, we will see that the power of the Corsairs after 1810 was indeed broken for some time, until long after the Wainrider period. With his southern borders secure, Kalimetar could contemplate a counterstroke against the newly arrived Easterlings. And, as was so often the case during Gondor's history, aid would come from the Northmen. These, under Marhuini, son of Marhari, had not been content simply to make new homes in the vales of the Anduin, but had been watching the movements of the Wainriders and maintained communications with Gondor. They were able to alert Kalimetar that the Wainriders were plotting to raid Kalinardon over the Undeeps, but they said also that a revolt of the Northmen, who had been enslaved, was being prepared and would burst into flame if the Wainriders became involved in war. While it seems to have been defended to various degrees during and after this period, the overall impression of Kalinardon prior to Eorl's ride out of the north seems to be of a province in decline. We have no evidence of heavy settlement in the region, especially in its eastern parts, only that the western shores of the Anduin were fortified by Romendikil II, and the province seems not to have been crucial for Gondor's economy or for the feeding of its people. It is therefore noteworthy that Kalinardon should be thought the target of a raid. What did Kalimetar or Marhuini think the Wainriders would accomplish there? Most likely the people who dwelt in the province would have lived in a similar fashion to the Wainriders and the later Rohirrim themselves, in the open, keeping herds. It may then have been livestock and movable goods that the Wainriders would have wanted. In the event, the raid itself never occurred. An extremely cynical observer might posit that this impending raid was a fiction of Marhuini, who needed Gondor's aid in his last desperate bid to retake the old homeland of his ancestor Vidugavia. His ambition, of course, was for this campaign to lead to his and his people's return to their conquered territory, where they would liberate their enslaved kinsfolk. In 1899, only a generation separated them from their earlier freedom, and some of the older Northmen, like Marhuini himself, would have remembered a time before the Wainriders. Kalimetar's campaign of 1899 is the last time the province of Kalinardon figures prominently in either Gondor's or any Easterling strategy, before the invasion of the Balcoth some 600 years later. As we have seen, the western shores of the Anduin had been fortified long before in response to Easterling invasion, and that Kalinardon was in some way defended after the Wainriders' appearance is implied by the statement that Gondor's borders were withdrawn to the Anduin. The presence of some garrison in eastern Calenardon is given more concrete evidence by the statement that during the 1944 campaign, the forts upon the line of the Anduin north of Sarn-Gibur that had been built by Narmekil I were still in repair and manned by sufficient soldiers from Calenardon to prevent any attempt of an enemy to cross the river at the Undeeps. Although these forts would later be unmanned and neglected during the watchful peace of 2063 to 2460, Cirion would put a few men into the old forts to keep watch on the Undeeps, the last act of Gondor in defense of Calenardon, a province that seems always to have been just beyond Gondor's abilities to populate or secure. These defenses along the Anduin suggest an interesting dimension to the Wainrider conflict, quite apart from the annals of kings and their battles. The river, and in particular the Undeeps, as the most feasible crossing, was the frontier across which the two powers eyed each other. While no skirmishes here are recorded, the close proximity of the enemies along that narrow border may have led to minor forays and perhaps other forms of engagement and communication. Still, Gondor's intelligence of the Wainriders was notably poorer than that of the Eotheod, who were able to receive information not only regarding the plans of their own enslaved people, but apparently regarding the planned movements of the Wainriders themselves. Regardless, we are much better informed about the course of Kalimetar's campaign and the Battle of 1899 than we are for the first engagement of Gondor with the Wainriders. Kalimetar, as soon as he could, led an army out of Ithilien, taking care that its approach should be well known to the enemy. The Wainriders came down with all the strength that they could spare, and Kalimetar gave way before them, drawing them away from their homes. At length, battle was joined upon the Dagorlad, and the result was long in doubt. But at its height, horsemen that Kalimetar had sent over the Undeeps, left unguarded by the enemy, joined with a great Aeorid led by Marhuini, assailed the Wainriders in flank and rear. The organization, communication, and coordination necessary for this campaign were considerable. Marhuini's Aeorid must have come down the east side of the Anduin, where it joined with Kalimetar's horsemen. These horsemen could have been native men of Gondor, but it is just as likely that they were in fact Northmen who had entered Gondor's service, something we first see in Romendikil II's day. For his part, Kalimetar's battle had to coincide with the Northmen revolt and with the joining of cavalry forces from two different areas behind enemy lines. Kalimetar's signaling of his approach to the enemy and his careful, planned withdrawal southward before them must have tested the morale of his men, who would have known that the foe they now faced had defeated the great army of Narmekil II some 43 years before, and had never been beaten by a force of Gondor. It is unclear how far out of Ithilien Kalimetar's army traveled. He seems to have marched north past Dagorlad until drawing the attention of the Wainriders and withdrawing back south. We know that after the battle, surviving Wainriders fled north, presumably back in the direction of their march. But how long would it have taken for Kalimetar's approach to become well known to the enemy? The speed with which the Wainriders responded seems indicated by the fact that they left the Undeeps unguarded in apparent panic. That might suggest Kalimetar's force had indeed marched far north, perhaps coming level with the northernmost extent of the Emyn Muil or the South Undeep, far enough to be considered a grave threat to the Wainriders' territory. Of course, drawing the enemy away from the Undeeps was necessary for the surprise of the climactic cavalry charge, so it is probable that Kalimetar's force did not approach the Undeeps themselves, lest the gathering enemy discover the allied cavalry. Gondor's army, then, most likely kept to a fairly straight line north from Dagorlad. This would put them close to the location of the Battle of the Plains, where Kalimetar's father had been killed, no doubt adding to the intensity of the moment. The length of Kalimetar's march northward may have implications for the extent of the Wainriders' system of surveillance. All we are told of their borders is that they had had guards at the Undeeps, clearly in opposition to the forces of Gondor stationed on the opposite bank. Kalimetar's army seems to have encountered no resistance on his northward march until the Wainrider host appeared. But they were observed, which suggests the Wainriders had some scouts, likely small groups of horsemen, in the Brownlands. These would have flown back to the chieftains or other leaders who would then call the muster. It seems that Kalimetar's force in this campaign was not particularly strong, having been assembled as soon as it could. This force in the event was apparently an even match for all the strength that the Wainriders could spare. The matter was determined in part by a great Aeorid of Marhuini, which may give us a further clue of the size of the forces involved. At least in the century prior to the War of the Ring, among the Rohirrim a full Aeorid in battle order was reckoned to contain not less than 120 men. Perhaps Marhuini's great Aeorid numbered more than this, and maybe the term in this period had not yet acquired any great precision. But in the absence of any other evidence, it may be reasonable to suspect that Marhuini's horsemen numbered at most in the hundreds, especially if we take into account the difficulties they had suffered in their relatively recent flight from their homelands. Still, these few riders, together with horsemen from Gondor, were enough to end the battle. Of course, no numbers for the opposing forces are given, and we do not know how this Wainrider host compared with the first in terms of size, but it may well have been less. While the Undeeps and doubtless other places were left unguarded by the enemy, that enemy had suffered considerably in the Battle of the Plains in 1856, so that they had not strength enough to press their invasion until reinforced from the east. It is difficult to know if sufficient reinforcements had yet arrived. Perhaps the rumors of planned raids in Calenardon are an indication that reinforcements had indeed come, but a raid is not necessarily the continuation of an invasion. It seems rather that the Wainriders, upon becoming aware of Kalimetar's approach, hastily assembled all the warriors they could in an attempt to end Gondor's counterstroke before it could properly begin. In this, they were unsuccessful. The result of the battle was long in doubt. The Wainriders were unable to quickly bring the matter to a conclusion, for example through an opening chariot assault, and were likely obliged to engage in the sort of wearying, static infantry clash that would have favored the soldiers of Gondor. Despite fighting on open terrain, the Wainriders seemed to have been unable to perform any flanking maneuvers, or at least Gondor's horsemen got to them first. The hammer blows of cavalry to the Easterlings' flank and rear led to a victory that was overwhelming, but, oddly, not in the event decisive. Indeed, although we are told that following the battle the enemy broke and were soon in disordered flight north towards their homes, and that the horsemen of Marhuini harried the fugitives and inflicted great loss upon them in their long route over the plains, we are also told that Kalimetar, wisely for his part, did not pursue them. No doubt Kalimetar's own forces had also suffered in the battle, but more than this, we learn that this victory was not sufficient to dislodge the Wainriders from their new lands. We are given the impression that, had Kalimetar pursued the fleeing enemy, his forces would have been in danger, a danger that the riders of Marhuini were apparently able to avoid. The Wainriders did not intentionally hold back a reserve force for this purpose, but we can assume that in their haste to muster, they had not been able to gather all their warriors from their far-flung territory. Some bands of fighters would have remained, and, more significantly, while the battle was a clear victory for Gondor, the revolt, for which the battle was largely a distraction, was a failure. The revolt, planned and assisted by Marhuini, had indeed broken out. Desperate outlaws coming out of the forest had roused the slaves, and together had succeeded in burning many of the dwellings of the Wainriders, and their storerooms, and their fortified camps of wagons. But most of them had perished in the attempt, for they were ill-armed, and the enemy had not left their homes undefended. Their youths and old men were aided by the younger women, who in that people were also trained in arms, and fought fiercely in defense of their homes and their children. Thus, in the end, Marhuini was obliged to retire again to his land beside the Anduin, and the Northmen of his race never again returned to their former homes. In the end, too much strength must have remained among the Wainriders, and too little among the slaves and outlaws, to make feasible the reoccupation of the conquered portion of Rhovanion. In the aftermath of the battle itself, the Wainriders left well nigh a third of their host dead to rot upon the Daggerlad. Marhuini's horsemen further inflicted great loss on the survivors, but many could have remained to regroup among any of the fortified camps of wagons that the slaves had not burned. It is significant that the pursuing horsemen did not follow the fleeing enemy closer than within far sight of Mirkwood. They were not strong enough, in other words, to attempt by themselves the reconquest of Rhovanion, and if Kalimetar's restraint in the matter is a guide, neither was the remaining force of Gondor. Despite Marhuini's instigation of the revolt, his careful planning with Gondor, and the decisive role of his horsemen in the battle, his ambition was unfulfilled. With Marhuini's return to the new land of the Eotheod, and Kalimetar's withdrawal to Gondor, the surviving Wainriders were left to their own devices, to remain and rebuild, or to flee into the east. Many of them remained, enough to prevent the return of the Eotheod, but not enough to assemble new force to harass Gondor for some time. Kalimetar's and Marhuini's victory, while it did not end the threat, bought time and the ultimate survival of their peoples. The details of the revolt and its outcomes offer some insight into the nature of communications between Marhuini and his enslaved kin. Outlaws coming out of the forest were the primary means by which the slaves were roused to revolt, but the fact that these outlaws are identified as desperate suggests that Marhuini was unable to provide the gear or men sufficient to the task. It is perhaps unsurprising that this should be so. It would be another century before Sauron would be driven from Dol Guldur. While his power was not yet fully revealed, the shadow that had fallen over Mirkwood had had centuries to deepen, and no doubt any treks through the forest to allow communication between Marhuini and the enslaved Northmen would have been fraught with danger. The use of the term outlaws is also perhaps significant. These outlaws of the Northmen were likely men who refused to accept the final loss of their land, living together in small bands the better to harass the subjugators. So Turin Turambar had lived, among houseless and desperate men lurking in the wild. But while outlawed in the sense that they were denied the homes of their fathers, they were in good standing with Marhuini of the Eotheod, who used these men as agents. Apart from slaying and robbing any of the Wainriders that they could, the outlaws needed to communicate with the slaves. Both of these tasks required that they learn woodcraft and stealth, no doubt surpassing the abilities of the Wainriders themselves. As for the Wainriders, this passage provides our closest look at their domestic life. More than 4 decades after their invasion, they, or a new-come kin from the east, were still employing fortified camps of wagons, as though they were a host on the move, and indeed they may well have been. No doubt these fortified camps employed in Rovanion resembled the lager or carago used by the Goths, a circular formation that could be drawn up relatively quickly in times of emergency or when in hostile territory. The fact that such structures were still used in Rovanion more than 40 years after the conquest suggests that the Wainriders remained mobile in their new territory, their chieftains regularly visiting various population centers in peripatetic fashion. Maybe, too, the threat posed by the outlaws who assisted the slave revolt was considered great enough to warrant the continuation of this protective formation. Apart from dwellings and storehouses, we receive no other indication that the Wainriders built permanent structures. They may have used the buildings that they found already made by the Northmen, if the taunt of the horsemen of Marhuini, "See, the homes you stole are in flames," can be taken literally. The nature of the guard over the Undeeps which the Wainriders had maintained prior to the battle is nowhere stated, but it is unlikely to have involved permanent fortifications. Their way of life would probably have been similar to that of the Northmen of Rovanion before their invasion, whose settled homes seem perhaps to have been seasonal or temporary dwelling places. Otherwise they lived in wide plains, mostly in the open. That desperate outlaws came out of the forest may even indicate the location of important Wainrider settlements or camps in the region. The revolt must have occurred relatively close to the forest, which would have made easier the necessary communication between Marhuini's instigators and the Wainriders' slaves. Of course, no capital is indicated for the Wainriders in Rovanion, but given that the East Bight and the eastern fringes of the forest had been identified as the location of the Northmen settlements, we may assume that this area was also important to the Wainriders themselves. The taunting horsemen of Marhuini, when pursuing the defeated Wainriders within farsight of Mirkwood, advised them to fly east, since there was a great smoke going up in the north. For the smoke from burning homes or camps to have been visible even far from Mirkwood, we can assume that the Wainrider camps or the settlements they occupied were clustered toward the south-southeast of the forest. The injunction to fly east, not north, is another indication that the slave uprising had not spread far into the plains east of the forest itself. For the revolt to have done as significant damage as was no doubt intended, there must have been a considerable number of the Wainriders clustered near the forest, either in settlements or camps. The plan, then, was well considered, though unsuccessful. Marhuini had not accounted for the valor of the defending population. In the end, it seems many of the Wainriders did not heed the taunting advice of Marhuini's riders. Plenty of them flew northward to trouble the Eotheod in coming decades and prevent the Northmen from returning. Their stolen homes were in flames, but the Wainriders would rebuild. The life of the slaves of the Wainriders may have resembled the thraldom of the men of Hithlum in the First Age. On that occasion, too, Easterlings had come into possession of new territory and the former inhabitants. However, there were differences between the scenarios, beginning with the fact that the Easterlings of the First Age may not have been related in any way to the much later Wainriders. They also were given their territory by Morgoth, holding it as a fiefdom, rather than choosing it themselves. Morgoth confined them to Hithlum as much as they confined the thralls who remained, and so we may not take their way of life as representative of that which they would have preferred. The occupiers of Hithlum, at any rate, led a sedentary life, taking up the titles and houses of the former lords. Whether something similar occurred during the Wainrider occupation of Rhovanion is not certain, but the presence of Wainrider dwellings, storehouses, and fortified camps of wagons at the precise location of the Northmen's former settlements suggests a degree of continuity through the Northmen and Wainrider periods. The tradition among the Wainriders of young women being trained in arms is not unique in Middle-earth, though it is rare. The only other such tradition dates to the First Age folk of Haleth. One of the strange practices spoken of was that many of their warriors were women, though few of these went abroad to fight in the great battles. This custom was evidently ancient, for the chieftainess Haleth had been a renowned Amazon with a picked bodyguard of women. An author's note here says that the custom was ancient, not due to their special situation in Beleriand, and maybe rather a cause of their small numbers than its result. They increased in numbers far more slowly than the other Atani, hardly more than was sufficient to replace the wastage of war, yet many of their women, who were fewer than the men, remained unwed. The people of Haleth remained apart from the ancestors of Numenor and Gondor, but it is perhaps possible to imagine some ancient kinship between the Easterlings and other men who in the First Age traveled into the West. Some memory of the tradition may also have been preserved among the Rohirrim, the descendants of the Eotheod and the Northmen of Rhovanion, as seen in Eowyn's use of the term Shield Maiden. The immediate result of the 1899 campaign was that Gondor enjoyed for a time, from 1899 to 1944, a respite from war. Kalimetar's victory may not have been decisive in the sense that it destroyed the new state of the Wainriders in Rhovanion, but the battle and revolt cowed them for 45 years. Still, they must have resented bitterly the instigators of the revolt. When we next hear of the Wainriders conducting raids, they would not turn their attention against the crossings at the Undeeps, or any other part of Gondor's territory. The final invasion of the Wainriders was preceded by a warning, once again from the Eotheod. Forthwini, son of Marwhini, indeed warned King Andohair, who succeeded his father Kalimetar in the year 1936, that the Wainriders of Rhovanion were recovering from their weakness and fear, and that he suspected that they were recovering new strength from the east, for he was much troubled by raids into the south of his land that came both up the river and through the narrows of the forest. But Gondor could do no more at that time than gather and train as great an army as it could find or afford. Thus, when the assault came at last, it did not find Gondor unprepared, though its strength was less than it needed. More evidence that Kalimetar's 1899 campaign had indeed broken the power of the Wainriders of Rhovanion for some time can be found in the suspicion of Forthwini that they were receiving new strength from the east. If Forthwini's people had suffered raids earlier, they seem not to have much troubled the Eotheod until now. We know that Gondor enjoyed a respite from war during this period, and according with this statement, the Wainriders seem not to have felt strong enough to attempt a raid into Calenardon. The fact that the only explanation for the apparent resurgence, at least as far as Forthwini was concerned, was the new arrival of strength from the east, suggests that to the Northmen, who were in the best position to know, the Wainriders of Rhovanion themselves had been mostly dormant since their 1899 defeat. We do not have a date for the raids, but Forthwini's warning to Andohair seems to have come after his crowning in 1936. 37 years is enough time for the Wainriders of Rhovanion to have recovered at least some of their population, but we are not certain what proportion of their population was lost in the events of 1899. Almost a third of their host was left on Dagorlad, and more were slain in the route north. This host was apparently assembled mainly from the western parts of their territory, since the Undeeps were left unguarded and their homes were defended by youths, old men, and young women. But there may have been more warriors on the eastern plains or further north who had not been able to join the host. It would be interesting to know more about what kinds of forces were involved in these raids, especially those coming through Mirkwood. Travel through the narrows of the forest, the part of the forest west of the East Bight, would make the most direct route to the new homes and herds of the Eotheod, but it would put the Wainriders at a disadvantage, as we are later told that they, or at least their eastern kin, were accustomed to warfare in open lands. Raiding is, of course, different from battle, but nevertheless the journey must have been a difficult one, and it is perhaps noteworthy that the Wainriders are never said to make use of the Old Forest Road further north. This road was in disrepair at the end of the Third Age, some 1,000 years on, but at this time could conceivably have provided an easier route toward the lands of the Eotheod, which at this point were said to lie between the Carrock and the Gladden Fields. Failure to use the road could indicate that the Wainriders had no knowledge of it, or that their territory did not abut its eastern end, or that they received aid from Dol Guldur which made a southerly route more attractive. It could also be the case that the Wainriders of Rhovanion, having by this time dwelt alongside the forest for some 80 years, were adapting to maneuvers through wooded terrain. The raids, at any rate, seem to have been successful enough to cause Forthwini much trouble, but the Wainriders who took this route must have left their chariots behind. The other path of the raids, up the river, suggests that the Wainriders of Rhovanion were at this time in firm control of the eastern side of the Anduin. Although we are told that in 1944 the forts upon the line of the river north of Sarn Gabur were still in repair and manned, these forts were of no use in preventing or even apparently detecting the movements of the Wainriders on the eastern shore. The peace bought by Kalimetar's victory in 1899 had perhaps contracted the Wainriders' sphere of influence to the lands immediately east of Mirkwood, but in the time since then they had expanded once more to be able to conduct maneuvers all around the southern reaches of the forest. Still, while the Wainriders of Rhovanion had grown capable of conducting long-range raids through difficult terrain, they were no longer in a position to lead a great assault against Gondor. Until now, we have spoken of the Wainriders as a single entity, but in fact there have been hints in the records that there were two important and distinct Wainrider groups. The battles of 1856 and 1899, the initial invasion and the revolt, involved one group, but the following final clash would involve another. At first we read of the Wainriders of Rhovanion, that is, the invaders of 1851 who largely settled east of Mirkwood. But we soon see, in the lead-up to the final conflict, who the other group is. In the aftermath of the revolt and battle of 1899, the Wainriders licked their wounds and plotted their revenge. Beyond the reach of the arms of Gondor, in lands east of the Sea of Rhûn, from which no tidings came to its kings, their kinsfolk spread and multiplied, and they were eager for conquests and booty, and filled with hatred of Gondor which stood in their way. It was long, however, before they moved. On the one hand, they feared the might of Gondor, and knowing nothing of what passed west of Anduin, they believed that its realm was larger and more populous than it was in truth at that time. On the other hand, the eastern Wainriders had been spreading southward, beyond Mordor, and were in conflict with the peoples of Khand and their neighbors further south. Eventually a peace and alliance was agreed between these enemies of Gondor, and an attack was prepared that should be made at the same time from north and south. Two phrases here suggest the distinction between the Wainriders of Rhovanion, that is, the invaders of 1851, and the others. First, that their kinsfolk spread and multiplied in lands east of the Sea of Rhûn, and second, the term, the Eastern Wainriders. To be sure, Eastern in this phrase is not capitalized, but nonetheless the description of the different priorities and aims of these peoples reinforces the idea that the Wainriders were not a single monolithic entity, but a coalition of somewhat independent folk. Not a people, but a confederacy of many peoples. The Wainriders of Rhovanion were the tip of the spear, who cleared the path to Gondor by removing the bulwark of the Northmen of Rhovanion. Though their initiative was slowed in 1856 and stalled in the defeat in battle and revolt of 1899, they permanently denied both the Northmen and Gondor possession of significant territory east of Anduin and Mirkwood, and their descendants may have remained east of the forest for many centuries in relative quiet. But in the campaign of 1944, the Eastern Wainriders took the lead. The Wainriders had mustered a great host by the southern shores of the inland Sea of Rhûn, strengthened by men of their kinsfolk in Rhovanion and from their new allies in Khand. When all was ready, they set out for Gondor from the east. The Wainriders of Rhovanion here play a clearly subordinate role. The place of muster, south of the Sea of Rhûn, is a midway point between the centers of power of the people of Khand and the Wainriders of Rhovanion. It is also likely to have been some distance from the heartland of the eastern Wainriders, since the gathering of a great host would take time and strain the resources of the place of muster. The land south of the Sea of Rhûn seems never to have been a center of power for the Easterlings in itself, only the path through which they passed on their westward routes of invasion. In the lead-up to the wars against Khand and Harad and the subsequent campaign against Gondor in 1944, we are told that the kinsfolk of the Wainriders of Rhovanion spread and multiplied in lands east of the sea. We may suppose, then, that the chief lands of the eastern Wainriders lay fairly due east of this inland sea, and the place of muster was chosen in part as a fairly neutral zone which could accommodate the disparate forces of the great host. But the fact that this required the Wainriders of Rhovanion to travel hundreds of miles eastward, away from Gondor's borders, to join the attack, indicates that by this time the energies of their initial invasion had been spent, and they had become no more than support for the greater power. The eastern Wainriders were not involved directly with the initial conquest of Rhovanion, but no doubt the relative success of their kin would have encouraged many of them to attempt another westward push. However, first their aggression was directed south. Of course, nothing is known of the peoples living to the east or north of the eastern Wainriders, but it seems likely that any folk in those directions would have been already allied to or conquered by the Wainriders, or possibly that those lands held too few people or resources to trouble about. Given the existence in the west of Middle-earth of several apparently very depopulated areas, such as southern Eriador, it may well be that in the wake of the Great Plague and amidst other pressures of climate or resource scarcity, large swaths of the east were not suitable for the growth of large populations of men, or at least of men who lived in a manner similar to that of the Wainriders. Of other peoples in the east we know almost nothing. Dwarves certainly dwelt in mansions east of the Iron Hills, as we have already seen. The presence of elves in these lands, either Avari or, less likely, Sindarin adventurers, cannot be discounted. But if the Wainriders had any interactions with these peoples, we have no record or suggestion of it. Southward, though, seem to have been lands teeming with peoples. Khand has been mentioned above, and in Appendix A we learn that their neighbors further south are men of near Harad. The hint of interactions between the eastern Wainriders and these other folk is tantalizing, but in the annals of the kings and rulers the nature of these interactions is unclear. Only in Cirion and Eorl do we learn that passing south of Mordor and making alliance with men of Khand and of near Harad follows an apparent attempted war of conquest on the part of the Wainriders, a war which seems to have ended in a qualified success. Khand and near Harad were not conquered and occupied as were the Northmen of Rhovanion, but some arrangement was reached. The Wainriders, while denied total victory, seem to have achieved a degree of dominance. It is difficult to imagine how the Wainriders could have threatened the peoples of near Harad without first securing passage through Khand, probably by forcing the latter to submit. Further evidence of that submission is the fact that the people of Khand, never before having warred with Gondor, sent forces to the invasion of 1944, joining the muster south of the Sea of Rhûn. If we grant that the strongest arm in the Wainrider host was their chariots, and in Khand was their cavalry, as will be seen, we may be able to infer some of the contours of the war between the two peoples that preceded their 1944 Allied invasion. While the terrain of eastern Middle-earth is vague, both Khand and the territory of the eastern Wainriders seem to have been relatively flat. Flat, open terrain is a prerequisite for the development of large-scale chariot and cavalry warfare. While chariot warfare is relatively inefficient compared to cavalry, the Wainriders seem to have been the more numerous and better-armed power, as attested by the annalist's statement that, from the perspective of Gondor at least, the Wainriders were stronger and better armed than any other Easterlings. Gondor had no other experience fighting Khand prior to the War of the Ring, and thus no comparison between Khand and the Wainriders can be inferred from the annals, But it is reasonable to suppose that Khand was, both in numbers and in gear, insufficient to resist the Wainriders, and unable to prevent them from striking beyond their territory, further south into Near Harad. In Near Harad, the chariots of the Wainriders may have encountered a check. Almost nothing is known of the peoples of the Harad, but their territories were vast. In the days of High Armendikil I, they are reported as having kings. During the War of the Ring, Damrod, a companion of Faramir, was aware of dealings of old between Gondor and the kingdoms of the Harad in the far south, though there was never friendship. In those days, our bounds were away south beyond the mouths of Anduin, and Umbar, the nearest of their realms, acknowledged our sway. Kings and kingdoms suggest a degree of political organization as well as several potentially large realms. It is difficult to determine precisely to which period Damrod is referring. His notions of Gondor's history seem vague. But if Khand succeeded at least in maintaining a degree of independence from the Wainriders as allies rather than as vassals, it is perhaps unlikely that the Wainriders accomplished much more in the south than bringing the Haradrim into negotiations for peace and cooperation against Gondor. We hear of no Mumikil being employed during the Wainrider period, but if they were fielded against a Wainrider invasion, the beasts would likely have overawed the attackers, and the horses that drew their chariots. While the men of Harad may have needed little encouragement to invade Gondor given their long history, there is no record of dealings of any sort between Gondor and Khand prior to this date. Indeed, the use of Khand in the context of the Wainrider Wars marks the first appearance of that name in the Legendarium. Even at the height of Gondor's power around Third Age 1050, when the kings of the Harad did homage to Gondor and their sons lived as hostages in the court of its king, no mention is made of the people or region of Khand. Two reasons for this omission may be supposed. Either Khand remained outside the influence of Gondor at this time, having no interactions with them, which seems unlikely given the breadth of High Armendikil's power, or Khand may not yet have arisen as an independent realm. Supporting this latter claim is the fact that, outside the Wainrider context, Khand only occurs in The Lord of the Rings, in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, where Variags of Khand are listed among the other tributary peoples of Mordor. The word Variag appears again later in the same chapter, where they are driven away by the Knights of Dol Amroth. A linguistic kinship between Easterlings, Southrons, Variags, and Khand seems confirmed by a note found in Peoples of Middle-earth, the appendix on languages. Of the speech of men of the East and allies of Sauron, all that appears is Mumak, a name of the great elephant of the Harad. Tolkien later added Variag and Khand to these words. The original note seems to indicate that men of the East and allies of Sauron are to be taken as one and the same, rather than referencing two or more distinct language groups. Variag has itself an interesting etymology beyond Tolkien's linguistic subcreation. It is related to the word Varangians, as in the famous merchant warriors who traverse the great riverways of Russia to the Black Sea and Constantinople. The word is of Slavic and ultimately Norse origin. Does the use of Variag imply a link between the Northmen and these inhabitants of Khand? Evidence for this possibility may be suggested in the Annals, where we earlier noted the disloyalty of some Northmen living in Rhovanion. Groups of renegade Northmen taking up arms with Easterlings may have remained after Minalcar's victory in 1248, but with little hope of seeking fortune against a powerful Gondor, they could have turned south to seek plunder or adventure in new lands. The name Variag would seem perfectly fitting to Northmen having undertaken such a journey. On the other hand, no Variags are mentioned during the Wainrider period. Variags are attested at the earliest during the final phase of the War of the Ring, Third Age 3018, and indeed no later. No mention of either Variags or Khand is made when King Elessar pardons Easterlings, makes peace with the peoples of Harad, and gives the lands about Lake Nirnan to the freed slaves of Mordor. The implication may be that the Variags were all slain or escaped, or that Elessar did not feel able or willing to deal with their realm. Variags aside, the most reasonable date for the establishment of Khand is after the supremacy of High Armendikil I, when Gondor began its decline, and as a result created opportunities for new realms to arise beyond its borders. The weakening of other Easterlings following Minalcar's 1248 campaign would also have created a vacuum in the region that Khand could have exploited. Khand seems not to have been a newcomer to the area when they became a target for the Wainriders. And in the earlier Wainrider period, competition from the rising young confederacy would seem to be an obstacle to the establishment of a new realm. Perhaps then we could place the first arising of Khand prior to the onset of the Great Plague, and after the defeat of the men of Harad by Hyar-Mendical II, say between 1551 and 1635. Of course, the speculative nature of this dating will be obvious. Regardless, we know that by 1944 at the latest, Khand had developed into an independent realm, not able to avoid the influence of the stronger Wainriders, but strong enough to stave off total conquest, and in the aftermath of that conflict, to retain sufficient warriors to send a march in the host of its new ally. Bringing these disparate foes, the Wainriders, the people of Khand, the men of Near Harad, into so sudden an alliance, and then training that alliance against Gondor in a coordinated, two-pronged attack, is in the annals ascribed not solely to the strength of the Wainriders themselves, but also to the designs of Sauron. Sauron's involvement with the Wainriders seems to have been known or assumed by the Eotheod as early as the Battle of 1899, when riders of Marhuini harrying the routing Wainriders of Rhovanion called them folk of Sauron. Somewhat later, Gondor appears to have come to a similar conclusion. It was in the reign of Arafant in the north and Andoher, son of Kalimetar, in the south, that the two kingdoms, Arnor and Gondor, again took counsel together after long silence and estrangement. For at last they perceived that some single power and will was directing the assault from many quarters upon the survivors of Númenor. It was at that time that Arvedui, son of Arafant, wedded Firiel, daughter of Andoher, 1940. But neither kingdom was able to send help to the other, for Angmar renewed its attack upon Arthedain at the same time as the Wainriders reappeared in great force. Clearly the involvement of this single power and will was seen as serious enough to warrant a rapprochement between the two realms, but to what extent was Sauron actually involved in the rise and direction of the Wainriders? Appendix A says only that the Wainriders were stirred up, as was afterward seen, by the emissaries of Sauron. Cirion and Eorl says of the alliance of the powers in the east and south that little or nothing, of course, was known of these designs and movements in Gondor. What is here said was deduced from the events long afterward by historians, to whom it was also clear that the hatred of Gondor and the alliance of its enemies in concerted action, for which they themselves had neither the will nor the wisdom, was due to the machinations of Sauron. The imputation of these statements to historians, to whom it was clear, seems to invite some doubt. We are receiving here not the certain report of an omniscient narrator, but the deduction of unidentified historians with limited access to information. Still, Sauron's involvement in these movements is beyond question. Biding his time in Dol Guldur, not assembling vast hosts or subjugating peoples as he would later do in the War of the Ring, he seems to have been content to influence the course of the Wainriders, no doubt enticing them with reports of Gondor's wealth and lands. We can reject the possibility that the Wainriders' superior arms and strength were directly due to Sauron arming them himself, or sharing knowledge of forging and crafting. Prior to the Wainrider invasion, he was yet taking shape in Dol Guldur, no doubt in a weakened state. And in any case, the bulwark of Rhovanion still remained at that time to hinder his communication with and support of any of his allies in the east. It is therefore likely that his greatest achievement in the affair would have been the coordination of the two-pronged attack of 1944, assuming we accept the assertion of historians of Gondor that such coordination would have been beyond the will and wisdom of these peoples. As for the forces assembled by the Eastern Wainriders, we can make some inferences. That the Wainriders, or their allies from Khand, used bows is not surprising, but is only confirmed by the statement that Minotaur, captain of Gondor's rearguard, was slain by an arrow. More significantly, we were told that the invasion of 1944 contained an unexpectedly large number of horsemen. While these cavalry are not explicitly said to belong to Khand, their surprising appearance here, combined with the fact that the only new element to the Wainriders' host, as far as Gondor would have been concerned, was that of their new allies in Khand, indicates that Khand had sent a very large group of riders to the war. We read that the enemy vanguard was composed not only of the war chariots of the Wainriders, but also of a force of cavalry far greater than any that had been expected. The Wainriders themselves seem not to have possessed great numbers of horsemen. Granted, none of their war gear apart from chariots is mentioned, but the later Balcoth are described as having no great number of horses for riding, using horses mainly for draft since they had many large wains, as had the Wainriders, to whom they were no doubt akin. And historically, chariot use seems generally to precede and then be replaced by organized use of cavalry. The fact that the 1994 attack is the first time we hear of horsemen and cavalry in conjunction with a Wainrider attack is a suggestion that perhaps they were slowly beginning to adopt a new technology. Interestingly, the reference in the Muster of Rohan from the messenger of Gondor to Theoden, claiming that many kings have ridden in from the east to the service of Mordor, may indicate a continuation of this process by the War of the Ring. And atop Amon Hen, Frodo spies out of the east men moving endlessly, swordsmen, spearmen, bowmen upon horses, chariots of chieftains, and laden wains. The use of chariots thus survived the Wainrider period by over 1,000 years, but by this time may have been mostly ceremonial or restricted to transport. No such vehicles appear at the Pelennor fields. By the same token, the fact that the cavalry was greater than expected suggests that at least some cavalry of the Wainriders had been anticipated. We can therefore infer that the Wainriders did indeed make use of horsemen in their campaigns, but in a limited capacity. It is unlikely, for example, that the Wainriders' horsemen would have been used as shock cavalry. This seems to have been the role of the chariots themselves. But horsemen could travel where chariots could not, so it is probable that the Wainrider cavalry were used in a support role, or for scouting duties. This brings us finally to a consideration of the most famous weapon of the Wainriders, the chariot. We are not given enough information to determine how or even how many chariots were used by the Wainriders. The first mention in Appendix A seems to suggest that chariots are limited to the elite, as a weapon of rank and prestige. Their chieftains fought in chariots. Later the term war chariots is used, though it is uncertain precisely what this is meant to convey. But in the discussion of the Battle of 1944, a mass charge is described, a charge of horsemen in chariots in great weight, hurled against Ondoher's banner. The assault of the enemy passed over them and about both sides of the knoll, driving deep into the disordered ranks of Gondor, hurling them back in confusion upon those behind and scattering and pursuing many others westward into the dead marshes. The sheer numbers involved suggest the presence of a dedicated corps of chariots, consisting of trained teams of horses and men, drivers, archers, shield-bearers, spear-throwers, or wielders of other weapons. Certainly the thought of the Wainriders opening battle by hurling only their leaders headlong into the ranks of Gondor seems unbelievable, and we should not assume that only the chieftains fought in chariots, but that the chieftains chose to fight among the chariot corps, which was probably the arm of the host that had received the best training, armor, and weaponry, since it would have been the most expensive to equip and prepare. There, more mobile than the infantry and better protected than on horseback, accompanied by the elite warriors of his people, a chieftain would have been most able to win glory for himself through a successful charge, and to effect a retreat in the event of failure. Their use in the 1944 assault reveals that the Wainriders, at least in this instance, used their chariots as a weapon of shock, risking all on a successful drive at the enemy. In many battles, it may have been that the threat of the approach was enough to break the morale of the defenders and send them running away, where they would have been easy prey for the chariot warriors or the few horsemen. In fact, the 1944 charge seems to have been much more visceral. We hear that the chariots and horsemen crashed into the disordered line, hurling the defenders back in confusion against those behind. The success of this assault came as a surprise to the Wainriders themselves. The charge of their chariots and cavalry had met with a success far swifter and more overwhelming than they had expected. It is notable that in this charge the chariots and cavalry are always mentioned together. This combination of arms seems to have been novel, both to the men of Gondor and to the Wainriders themselves, both of whom were surprised by the outcome. If deployment of chariots in the vanguard was typical for the Wainriders, deploying cavalry there was apparently not, and it seems that the unexpected number of horsemen, likely armed and trained as shock cavalry, was the decisive factor. We may assume that these cavalry were well armored and possibly armed with lances for the charge. It is unclear whether the cavalry were interspersed among the chariots or fought in a separate formation, The latter seems more likely, but the impression from the narrative is not of two distinct arms, but of a chaotic onrush of the enemy. Regardless, however they fought, the warriors of Khand proved their worth. We have, of course, no evidence about the size of the chariots themselves or the numbers of horses or crew. No scythes are mentioned, at least. But given the aggressive use to which they were put in the Battle of 1944, we may assume that Wainrider chariots, at least those involved in the charge, were not light and maneuverable like Celtic or Egyptian chariots, which were intended for a driver and archer. Perhaps instead they resembled the heavier Hittite chariots, larger, more cumbersome, but providing space for 3 men or more, a driver, shield-bearer, or javelin thrower, and a more heavily armed combatant. On the other hand, the fact that the Wainriders were surprised at the success of their charge might indicate that this battle was not typical. The reason for its success, we will see shortly, had a great deal to do with the fact that Anduin's troops were caught by surprise before having had a chance to deploy. The Wainrider vanguard saw an opportunity to attack an enemy that had not yet formed an ordered line. It may be, then, that in most situations the chariot warriors were archers or javelin throwers, who would only come into melee range when attacking a wavering enemy's flank or pursuing a broken foe. In this view, the 1944 charge was a consequence of seeing and exploiting an unexpected tactical advantage. Specialization of chariot units in warfare is more often associated with sedentary peoples than with nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples like the Wainriders seem to have been. Historical examples of peoples who journeyed in wains and fought in chariots are few. But if the Wainriders seem analogous to the Huns in some respects, their noted use of chariots makes them analogous to another steppe people, lesser known, the Sintashta and Andronovo cultures of Bronze Age Eurasia. From what we can tell, these peoples would have lived in very similar terrain to that of the Wainriders' open homeland in the east. Additionally, though archaeological evidence is scant, they may have used wagons for transport. They seem to have lived in a semi-nomadic fashion as pastoralists moving their herds according to the seasons, but also were known to build settlements of a few dozen to 100 houses. And they used chariots in battle, commonly with 2 passengers, 1 driver shield-bearer and 1 archer spearman. The mace, a symbol of power, also appears in their burials. Apparently the number of chariots that would be used in battles was not very great, which means their use was restricted to the elite, and they required support from other troop types. But they would have been a fast and powerful element on an otherwise infantry-dominated battlefield. David Anthony, author of The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, speculates about the use of these weapons as part of a military and social system. Steppe chariots might have operated in squadrons supported by individuals on foot or even on horseback, who could have run forward to pursue the enemy with hand weapons, or to rescue the charioteer if he were thrown. Chariots were effective in tribal wars in the steppes. They were noisy, fast, and intimidating, and provided an elevated platform from which a skilled driver could hurl a sheath full of javelins. Chariots were supreme advertisements of wealth, difficult to make and requiring great athletic skill and a team of specially trained horses to drive. They were available only to those who could delegate much of their daily labor to hired herders. A chariot was material proof that the driver was able to fund a substantial alliance or was supported by someone who had the means. Many of the points made here could apply to the Wainriders as well. It has been theorized that the earliest historical chariots were invented in part to solve a problem: how to utilize a horse, which could offer speed but had not yet been bred or trained to serve as a mount, in battle. The Wainriders' chariots cannot have developed in answer to this question. We have no description of their horses, but horses had been used as mounts for millennia before the Wainriders appeared. The Northmen in the Second Age alliance with the Longbeards were specifically said to do so. The Easterlings lived for centuries near Northmen and Rovanion, who were renowned for shock cavalry, and the attacks and alliances between these peoples would also have allowed them to acquire horses capable of bearing riders. For the Wainriders, the chariot was not a weapon of necessity, but of preference. Anduin became king in 1936, but may have only become aware of his enemy's plans some years later, since the dynastic marriage between his daughter and the heir of Arthedain, which was occasioned by the fear that a single power and will was arrayed against both kingdoms, took place in 1940. He had at most 8, perhaps as few as 4, years to gather and train his force before feeling ready to march out to meet the foe. Nothing is known of the training of soldiers in Gondor, but the reference to finding or affording an army is interesting. Did Anduin make use of mercenaries? And if so, where would they be found? His options would seem few. Of warriors from outside the realm, we know only that riders of the Eotheod joined his campaign. Southward were only enemies. Umbar had likely fallen by this time. Centuries before, Umbar had come under the rule of the sons of the usurper Castamir in Third Age 1448. There they made a refuge for all the enemies of the king, and a lordship independent of his crown. Umbar remained at war with Gondor for many lives of men, a threat to its coastlands and to all traffic on the sea. It was never again completely subdued until the days of Elessar, and the region of South Gondor became a debatable land between the corsairs and the kings. Umbar seems to have been the chief means by which Gondor's kings kept the peoples of Harad in check. One consequence of its loss, which was grievous to Gondor, was that the kingdom's hold upon the men of the Harad was loosened. The removal of Gondorian presence south of the Harnan would have allowed the Southrons to pursue their own wars, raise their own leaders, and grow into an unmanageable threat. The 1810 capture of Umbar by King Telumetar seems to contradict the statement that Umbar was never again completely subdued until Elessar's time. One way to reconcile these statements could be to view Telumetar's victory as a victory over the city of Umbar itself, while the hinterland and the nearby coasts remained unconquered. In this view, Gondor's capture of Umbar represents a brief and limited occupation of the city. While the power of the Corsairs was said to be broken with the retaking of Umbar, we know this was not permanent, as Corsair fleets would trouble the coasts of Gondor and beyond later in the Third Age. No date is given for the fall of Umbar after 1810, but it seems certain that Umbar had indeed fallen to forces of Harad rather than Corsairs prior to the 1944 invasion. The new masters of Umbar were unable to make effective use of the haven or fleet. Appendix A states that after Telumetar's retaking of Umbar, in the new evils that soon befell Gondor, Umbar was again lost, and fell into the hands of the men of the Harad. These new evils refer to the invasion of the Wainriders. The loss of Umbar occurring in, that is, during, the Wainrider invasion indicates that the loss occurred after 1851 and before the last clash in 1944. Speculating further, we may suppose that Umbar fell after 1899. Telumetar is said to have been free from other dangers prior to his campaign against the Wainriders in that year, and a footnote here specifically refers to Telumetar's prior capture of Umbar, which had broken the power of the Corsairs. In addition, the peoples of Harad were at this period engaged in wars and feuds of their own. With the Southrons preoccupied and Umbar still in Gondor's hands, Telumetar, as we have seen, could pursue his campaign untroubled. That Umbar had certainly fallen by 1944 is also apparent by the fact that it played no part in Gondor's defenses. Instead, we hear of forces assembled to face a Haradrian foe in South Ithilien. Surely if Umbar was still held by the king, it would have come under assault by the men of the Harad in this campaign. We learn of the lead-up to the invasion that Anduin was aware that his southern enemies were preparing for war, and he had the wisdom to divide his forces into a northern army and a southern. The latter was smaller, for the danger from that quarter was held to be less. A footnote here indicates that this assessment was just, for an attack proceeding from near Harad, unless it had assistance from Umbar, which was not at that time available, could more easily be resisted and contained. It could not cross the Anduin, and as it went north passed into a narrowing land between the river and the mountains. At first it may seem curious that assistance from Umbar was not at that time available to the Haradrim. Does this not mean the city was still held by Gondor then? Possibly, but assistance in this context must mean support by sea. Umbar fell, we are told, to men of the Harad, a people who are never described as attacking by sea. It is the Corsairs, the rebels during the Kinstrife, and their descendants and allies who provide sea power. With the Corsairs' own power temporarily broken by Telumetar's capture of 1810, possession of the city itself would provide the Southrons with a fortified stronghold, but not the ships and seacraft to make best use of its position. By the same token, if we take the statement that assistance was not at that time available to mean that Umbar was still in Gondor's hands, then it seems strange that we hear of no consideration for its defense, or even for stripping its garrison to protect the heartlands about the lower Anduin. The plan to funnel the enemy north into Ithilien suggests that the lands south of it, that is, south of the Poros, the lands corresponding to Harondor and as far as Umbar itself, remained lost to Gondor. If, on the other hand, Umbar did remain in Gondor's possession in 1944, even with a skeleton garrison it would seem unlikely to fall only after that campaign, in which, of course, Eärnil's southern army destroyed the army of Harad that had crossed the river Poros. In other words, the likeliest time for Umbar to have fallen would have been after 1899, and before the destruction of the Haradrian force in 1944. Anduin's plans included provision for 2 armies, one each for the threat from north and south. The fact that he came of a warlike line, his father had seen success against the Wainriders 45 years before, and was loved and esteemed by his army, suggests that morale in his force, the northern, was high. Anduin seems to have intended to fight in his father's footsteps. He had purposed to lead his host north through Ithilien, and deploy it on the Dagorlad, a field of ill omen for the enemies of Gondor. However, there are hints that suggest the king's intended strategy may have been unwise. Unlike his father, Anduin had not prepared a large-scale flanking maneuver of cavalry. Though we know that the Undeeps were manned sufficiently to prevent a Wainrider assault into Calenardon, Anduin seems never to have considered sending a detachment of troops that way, despite his expectation that the enemy would approach from the north or northeast. While men of the Eotheod fought with Anduin, possibly including their king, a leader whose name is indecipherable after the first element Mar, these forces appear to have accompanied the king in the center of the northern army. Anduin then seems to have intended to draw up his forces in a line of battle, the strength of which he would have relied upon to defeat his foe. But the Wainriders were most effective fighting in the open, and in this campaign they certainly would have outnumbered Anduin's northern army. Those numbers could be brought to bear most effectively on the plain of Dagorlad, which was also a battlefield of their choosing. Part of what saved Gondor was precisely the fact that the king's center was so swiftly and completely defeated, leaving his subordinates to withdraw and regroup further south, in the narrower land of Ithilien, and buying time for the southern army under Eärnil to catch the encamped Wainriders by surprise. Had Anduin deployed his entire northern army on Dagorlad as he intended, it may have been destroyed, and the Wainrider advance into Ithilien may have proceeded differently. We are also told that the fortifications higher up the Anduin were thought sufficient to prevent a crossing of the Undeeps, which suggests that an attack across the Brownlands was not thought to be out of the question. But there were some flaws in the intelligence Anduin was receiving. We are told that news of the northern assault did not reach Anduin until the morning of the 12th day of Kermier, approximately early July, by which time the enemy was already drawing near, whereas the army of Anduin had been moving more slowly than it would if Anduin had received earlier warning, and its vanguard had not yet reached the gates of Mordor. News of the northern assault is likely to have been received by scouts along the arid Lithui. We are told that at this point the Morannon was still in the control of Gondor, and the 2 watchtowers east and west of it, the Towers of the Teeth, were still manned. It is unclear how much farther east scouts of Gondor would have gone, but in the event they were surprised by the swiftness of the Wainriders, who had moved with all the speed they could along the line of the arid Lithui, where their approach was not observed until it was too late. So it came to pass that the head of the army of Gondor had only drawn level with the gates of Mordor when a great dust borne on a wind from the east announced the oncoming of the enemy vanguard. This assault of the Wainriders relied on speed, both at the strategic and tactical level. Anduin had only time to turn and face the assault with his right flank close to the Morannon, and to send word to Minotaur, captain of the right wing behind, to cover his left flank as swiftly as he could, when the chariots and horsemen crashed into his disordered line. The king sought what high ground he could find. With his guard and his banner, he had hastily taken up a position on a low knoll, but this was of no avail. The main charge was hurled against his banner, and it was captured. His guard was almost annihilated, and he himself was slain, and his son Artemir at his side. Their bodies were never recovered. The amount of enemy cavalry present at this engagement was, as we have seen, unexpected, and appears to have been the decisive factor. We can concur with the chronicler that Anduin was utterly unprepared to meet a charge of horsemen and chariots in great weight, but how would he have planned to meet this threat? Anduin's deployment on a low knoll suggests that his forces, like those of Aragorn, who would fight on the same ground in the War of the Ring, were on foot. But we also know that men of the Eotheod fought with Anduin in some capacity, and some of them survived the initial Wainrider charge to retreat toward the Dead Marshes, where Anduin's second and only remaining heir, having come to the battle in disguise, died of his wounds. The leader of the Eotheod then gave news of the prince's death to Minotaur. The cavalry of the Eotheod seems always to have been most effective in the charge, and in this case, there was no time to assemble and deliver the blow. The king and his guard were in the main force, the center of the northern army. This seems to have been almost entirely destroyed. Those of Minotaur's right who had deployed met the same fate, but there were some at the rear of the right wing who had not yet been engaged. The left wing, coming last and captained by Adrahil of Dol Amroth, was still intact. Minotaur took command after the deaths of the king and his heirs. While the cavalry and chariots now withdrew, for the main host of the Wainriders was approaching, he ordered 2 defensive lines to be laid across the enemy's path. Minotaur himself would act as rearguard at the head of the great north road of Ithilien, half a mile beyond the point where it turned east to the watchtowers of the Morannon. This would cover Adrahil's withdrawal to a defensive position between Caer Andros, which was manned, and the mountains of Ethelduath, where, owing to the great eastward loop of the Anduin, the land was at its narrowest, to cover as long as he could the approaches to Minas Tirith. The move to regroup Gondor's forces in a narrower place, to prevent outflanking from the superior numbers of the Wainriders, seems to have been well considered, but in the end, not enough to hold back the tide. Despite being unable to use their greater numbers with full effect according to the tactics they had intended, the Wainriders overcame Minotaur's rear guard, slaying the captain himself with an arrow, and poured relentlessly into Ithilien. Minotaur seems to have held out surprisingly long, however. When the main host of the Wainriders advanced to the attack, it was then 2 hours after noon on the 12th. It was not until late on the 13th day of Kermier that they overwhelmed Minotaur. The rearguard had held for at least a full day, allowing time for Adrahil's messengers to reach Eärnil's southern army. After the defeat of the rearguard, the chief commander of the Wainriders then called a halt to the advance, no doubt due to the lateness of the hour, and held a feast. Likely at this point, the Wainriders made a camp in their characteristic fashion, with wains providing a circle of defense. That they had brought wains with them on the campaign is clear from the brief account of the events in Appendix A, but the wains would be no barrier to Eärnil's men. In 1944, King Anduin and both his sons, Artemir and Faramir, fell in battle north of the Morannon, and the enemy poured into Ithilien. But Eärnil, captain of the southern army, won a great victory in South Ithilien and destroyed the army of Harad that had crossed the river Poros. Hastening north, he gathered to him all he could of the retreating northern army, and came up against the main camp of the Wainriders while they were feasting and reveling, believing that Gondor was overthrown and that nothing remained but to take the spoil. Eärnil stormed the camp and set fire to the wains, and drove the enemy in a great rout out of Ithilien. A great part of those who fled before him perished in the Dead Marshes. This concluding engagement of the Wainrider Wars with Gondor is called the Battle of the Camp in the Tale of Years. The quality of Eärnil's generalship is evident in the briefly recounted victory he won over the Haradrim. We learn that on receiving word of the approaching Southrons, Eärnil had already made his dispositions. He had crossed the Anduin with half his force and left by design the fords of the Poros undefended, making his camp some 40 miles north. The remaining half of the Sauron army may have remained at Eärnil's base at Pelargir or nearby, possibly on ship, either to scout along the coast and lower Poros, or to outflank the Haradrim, who could only cross the river at the fords. Splitting his forces, already smaller than the northern army, would seem a risky maneuver. If half were intended to disembark on the north bank of the Poros behind the advancing Southrons, they would need to time their approach carefully to avoid Eärnil's men being overwhelmed by the no doubt greater numbers of the enemy. But Eärnil succeeded, and his victory seems to have been great enough to prevent the Haradrim from attacking again for many centuries. The next Haradrim assault on the Poros would only occur over 900 years later. But Eärnil's work was not yet over. One gets the impression that the Wainriders only barely entered North Ithilien, and Eärnil stormed the camp at night just hours after Minotaur's rearguard was overwhelmed. But the sketch of events following Minotaur's taking over of command take the form of notes and jottings, for the most part illegible. Therefore, we cannot discount the possibility that more occurred between the fall of Anduin and Eärnil's battle of the camp. The passage of several days, even an encounter with Adrihil's forces. The latter seems implied by the statement that Eärnil, moving north against the Wainrider camp, gathered to him all that he could of the retreating northern army. Minotaur had ordered surviving elements of the northern army under Adrihil to take up a defensive position level with Caer Andros. After Minotaur's own death, all that remained of the rearguard fled southwards to find Adrihil. These men were the backstop for the northern army. If they still held their defensive position when Eärnil found them, they could not be described as retreating. Retreating elements of the northern army would seem to be either deserting from their defensive position prior to having been engaged by the Wainriders, or fleeing after the Wainriders overran Adrihil's position. The latter seems more likely. Still, the Wainriders were a large army and would seem to have been slowed by their apparent total victory. It may have taken them several days to come upon Adrihil's position. We are not told what day Eärnil won his victory in South Ithilien, but that news of the oncoming of the enemy reached his base in Pelargir on the 9th day of Cermie. The battle with the Haradrim may then have occurred on the 9th or 10th. Anduin was slain on the 12th, and Minotaur laid on the 13th. If Eärnil fought the southern foe at his position, 40 miles north of the Poros, he would be about 150 miles away as the crow flies from Adrihil's defensive line at Caer Andros, and at least another 50 from Minotaur's rearguard position, where the Wainriders first made camp. Assuming a marching speed of 35 miles per day, a forced march, Eärnil's southern army could have reached that Wainrider camp after close to 6 days of travel. If he departed on the 9th, Eärnil would arrive 2 days after Minotaur was slain, but that would mean the Wainriders had stayed in place for 2 days themselves, rather than continuing to advance into Ithilien. It also must be remembered that the disaster of the king's death occurred on the 12th. Only on the morning of that day did Anduin even become aware of the oncoming Wainrider assault. Eärnil may have fought the Haradrim on the 9th or 10th and begun to move north immediately thereafter, but he would not have known of the impending attack on the northern army until days later. It would seem more reasonable in any case to suppose that the Wainriders continued their southward push in the days following the 13th, and that it was on one of these days, not the same day that Minotaur fell, that Eärnil surprised them in their camp. Regardless of when or where precisely it was fought, the Battle of the Camp was a carefully considered and well-executed surprise attack. Eärnil seems to have attacked the main Wainrider camp at night, the most reasonable time for feasting and reveling, to increase the confusion and panic of his foes. But he seems also to have left a route of escape, northward. We are told that Eärnil drove the enemy in a great rout out of Ithilien, and that a great part of those who fled before him perished in the dead marshes. There was no great slaughter in the camp. Eärnil must have known that to completely surround a surprised enemy could stiffen their resolve and encourage them to fight to the last, and the Wainriders had taken very few casualties, meaning they would have outnumbered Eärnil's forces. Leaving an obvious path of retreat instead encouraged the rout that Eärnil then followed up with pursuit. Nothing is known of the composition of Eärnil's southern army, but it probably would have had fewer riders, since from the first the strategy in the south was one of static defense. The dead marshes, not riders from Gondor or the Northmen, claimed most of the fleeing enemy. Having examined the wars of the Wainriders in as much detail as the sources allow, we can sketch some broad conclusions. The Wainriders clashed with Gondor's armies in 5 known engagements. The first, the Battle of the Plains in 1856, is also the least detailed account. Narmakil II's great army was defeated, and the king slain in open country south of Mirkwood. Cavalry of the Northmen fought on Gondor's side and acted as a rearguard. Second, Kalimetar's victory over the Wainriders in 1899 was achieved largely due to a surprise flank and rear cavalry attack against the enemy. Well nigh a third of the Wainriders were slain, But, possibly because the result was long in doubt, and thus presumably many soldiers of Gondor were also killed, the battle was not decisive, although the strength of the Wainriders of Rhovanion was described as broken. Third, the 1944 charge against Anduin's northern army, accomplished with the war chariots of the Wainriders, as well as a force of cavalry, no doubt supplied in part from their new allies in Khand, which was far greater than any that had been expected. Anduin's presumably foot-bound, hastily deployed forces were a disordered line and utterly unprepared to meet a charge of horsemen and chariots in great weight. Fourth, on the following day, the Wainrider attack which overwhelmed the rearguard of Minotaur late on the day following Anduin's death. Despite the fact that the Wainriders came on in little order and were unable to use their greater numbers with full effect in the narrower land of North Ithilien, they were not long held up by the rearguard defense. Minotaur's death by an arrow may suggest that the Wainriders stood off and used missiles to wear down the defenders before throwing their greater numbers against them. Fifth, the Battle of the Camp, which took place at an uncertain date, but apparently involved a surprise attack against the main camp of the Wainriders while they were feasting and reveling. We can observe that the two victories for Gondor, Kelimetar's victory of 1899 and Eärnil's storming of the camp in 1944, involved the element of surprise. The charge that slew Anduin similarly involved a sudden attack that Gondor's forces were unprepared to withstand. The overwhelming of Minotaur's rearguard in 1944 was no doubt due to the great numbers of Wainriders present at that time, being brought to bear against a force that must have been small, no matter how well entrenched. The battle that saw victory for the Wainriders without apparently any unexpected charges or complex maneuvers was the Battle of the Plains. Unfortunately, little can be said for sure about this engagement, but it seems that the contenders were fairly even in numbers. Nevertheless, perhaps in part because it took place in open lands, allowing the Wainriders to fight in the manner to which they were accustomed, this battle was a sound defeat for Gondor. Taken together, these suggest that the forces of Gondor and the Wainriders were about evenly matched. Only when taking advantage of surprise or coordinating a complex outflanking maneuver could Gondor defeat the Wainriders. And conversely, the Wainriders were most sure of success against Gondor when they could swiftly bring their forces to bear against Gondor's disordered lines, or when they could overwhelm the defensive position thanks to greater numbers. It is also noteworthy that none of the engagements with the Wainriders involved sieges of settlements. The conquest of Rhovanion that continued after the Wainrider victory in 1856 must have involved some small-scale assaults on the settled homes of the Northmen, but these do not appear to have been fortified, and attacks against them are likely to have resembled the assaults and burnings of halls in northern heroic tradition, such as Icelandic saga. In fact, the only fortifications that are said to come under attack during the entire Wainrider period are the fortified camps of wagons in the 1899 revolt in Rhovanion and the Battle of the Camp. The wagons were, of course, of paramount importance to the Wainriders, and the losses in 1899 and 1944 of these vehicles and the possessions and people within them would have been catastrophic. The Wainrider threat to Gondor ended in disaster for the invaders, who thought themselves at the height of their powers. But as we have seen, this was not the end for the Easterlings, and indeed it seems likely that Wainrider polities would continue for some years. While their great host was destroyed, Eärnil did not follow up his victory with a trans-Anduin campaign. It was, we are told, long before Eärnil felt himself sufficiently secure to send aid to the North Kingdom against Angmar. One wonders what threats remained to trouble Eärnil after he had defeated both the Haradrim and the Wainriders within the space of a few days. Possibly the new king's insecurity was political rather than military. This, coupled with the losses to Gondor's army at the Morannon, kept Eärnil from a campaign of retribution in the east. But while the Wainrider heartlands, both in Rhovanion and east of the Sea of Rhûn, remained untouched, they suffered an undeniable decline in the years after the Battle of the Camp. The fallout from Eärnil's victory is unfortunately not recorded, but no doubt 1944 marked the end of the dominance of the Eastern Wainriders. Khand probably reclaimed its independence before falling under the dominance of Mordor in the following millennium. Certainly the traditions of the Wainriders, if not their confederacy itself, would endure. Wains rolled through Rhovanion and Calenardon in the days of Cirion and Eorl, and chieftains and chariots again took the west road along the arid Lithwy in the War of the Ring. Still, the Wainriders' defeat in 1944 can be said to mark the end of an era. Compared to the Wainriders, the Balcoth of 2510 were only rudely armed, and depended upon numbers to make up for what they lacked in gear of war. During the War of the Ring, the Easterlings were strong and war-hardened, but they were defeated, and though the victorious King Elessar pardoned the Easterlings who gave themselves up and sent them away free, they would not be free of him forever. We are told that wherever King Elessar went with war, King Eomer went with him, and beyond the Sea of Rhûn and on the far fields of the south, the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard. With Eomer's coming into the east, the story of the Wainriders closes in a circle, the final reprisal of the descendants of Rhovanion. The Wainriders were a people, or peoples, but what sort of folk were they? We can learn something by comparing the descriptions of the various Easterling groups given to us by the chroniclers. In the later Second Age, we read of many savage tribes in the east. In the first attacks upon Gondor, Third Age 490, they are described as wild men. The Easterlings who slew Romendakill I in 541 are called hordes. In 1248, we learn of Romendakill II defeating a large army of the Easterlings. There thus seems to have been a shift in Gondor's perception of these foes. In the very earliest encounters, they were merely savage, wild hordes. Only much later do we see the Easterlings forming what the chroniclers call an army. Of the Wainriders themselves, the words savage, wild, or horde are never used, but army is in the narrative of the 1944 invasion. At the Battle of 1899 and in the campaign of 1944, we are told that the Wainriders commanded a host, but this term does not connote any special organization or lack thereof. Host and army are, of course, also used of the forces of Gondor. The descriptor wild is also used by Faramir of the Easterlings during the War of the Ring. These pejoratives, savage, wild, and horde, and interestingly the terms tribe and kings, only correspond to the periods when Sauron was in more or less direct control of portions of the east. When Sauron's influence in the region waned, the terminology for Easterlings becomes more neutral. This suggests the nature of Sauron's influence. Under his control and urging, the Easterlings display characteristics that seem ferocious to the settled folk of the West. Absent Sauron, Easterlings are still capable of hostility, but are described as no wilder than the men of Harad or even the Northmen. If during the Wainrider period we no longer hear of wild hordes, nevertheless these people are marked out as distinct from their foes. After their initial success in battle in 1944, the Wainriders came on in little order, still exuberant and singing songs of victory. The chief commander then held a feast, and in the main camp they were feasting and reveling just prior to Eärnil's surprise attack. We do not see the armies of the West reveling after victory. This detail seems intended to show the simpler attitude of the Easterlings toward warfare. Victory is cause for celebration, not sorrow or pity for the defeated foe. The contrast with the words and behavior of Faramir, and of the other heroes of the West, is clear. It is doubtful that anything can be inferred about the Wainriders' appearance. The only descriptions of Easterlings date to much earlier or much later periods. Easterlings with axes are present at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. They may be the same men described in the Siege of Gondor as companies of men of a new sort that we have not met before, not tall, but broad and grim, bearded like dwarves, wielding great axes. Out of some savage land in the wide east they come, we deem. A link between these Easterlings with axes and certain Easterlings of the First Age may be guessed. In the Silmarillion of the Ruin of Beleriand, it is said of the swarthy men who came into Beleriand from the east that these men were short and broad, long and strong in the arm. Their skins were swart or sallow, and their hair was dark, as were their eyes. Their houses were many, and some had greater liking for the dwarves of the mountains than for the elves. But the fact that this general appearance seems to be unusual at the time of the War of the Ring suggests that this was not the norm among most Easterlings, and likely was not the norm for the Wainriders, whose appearance is nowhere described. Of the political organization of the Easterlings, almost nothing is known, but the structures that led to the grouping together of what appeared to Gondor's chroniclers as perhaps several distinct peoples would likely have arisen after Minalcar's destruction of Easterling camps and settlements in 1248. This event, which would have been shocking and traumatic, especially if it occurred east of the Sea of Rhûn, close to the Easterling heartland, could have provided the impetus necessary for the ancestors of the Wainriders to begin to form larger, more powerful groups. Minalcar's campaign could be considered the first great evil that befell the Easterlings in the Third Age and led to the formation of the Wainriders. Apart from the theoretical influence of Minalcar's venture of 1248, we may also infer something of Wainrider political structures from the geography of their homeland. As we have seen, Wainrider territory must have been fairly flat and open, yet likely not fertile enough to support large-scale agriculture. The terrain and climate thus not only facilitated a strong tradition of chariot warfare, it also allowed for the relative independence and mobility of the inhabitants. In a 2014 article in Mythlore, Dominic J. Nardi Jr. pointed out that realms with a more mobile and empowered citizenry are more likely to have less institutionalized governments. In addition, such citizenry are more likely to express dissent in the form of simply moving away from unfavorable political structures. We see several moments in the history of Middle-earth where both men and dwarves withdraw from the east in order to escape wars. We do not have any direct evidence of this sort of movement just prior to the Wainrider period, but the initial invasions of Rhovanion in 1851 may possibly be interpreted as a detachment of this sort. The chieftains and families who would later become the Wainriders of Rhovanion may have initiated their westward push in part to escape the aggrandizing moves of the eastern Wainriders. In any case, the barriers between the two groups were permeable. Eastern Wainriders are suspected of accompanying their western kinsfolk on raids up the Anduin, and some of the Wainriders of Rhovanion would later join the eastern Wainriders on their 1944 invasion. The movements between these groups are clearly not dictated by state-level policies enforced by an authority figure. They were processes natural to people who inhabited a terrain that encouraged, even demanded, mobility and reliance on smaller social units. We must wait more than 1,000 years after the decline of the Wainriders to learn more of Easterling political organization. During the War of the Ring, a messenger from Gondor remarked to Theoden that it is reported to us that many kings have ridden in from the east to the service of Mordor. This is the first, indeed the only, mention of kings in the East during the Third Age. It may be nothing more than the application of a familiar term to an unfamiliar people. These kings may have been not monarchs, but war leaders or mercenary captains. Regardless, the intelligence available to Gondor at the time identified them as kings, similar perhaps to the kings of the Harad mentioned in Hyar-Mendikil's day 2,000 years earlier, whose sons were raised in the court of Gondor's king. Both of those periods, Hyar-Mendikil's reign, which saw the height of Gondor's power, and the climax of Sauron's strength during the War of the Ring, provided reasonable conditions for the emergence of kingship among neighbors of those powers. It seems certain that such a process occurred among the Northmen to the northeast of Gondor's territory. While the chroniclers are careful to state that Vidugavia only called himself king of Rhovanion, the distinction may be academic. Whatever his title, Vidugavia was the father-in-law of one king of Gondor and the grandfather of another. We see a similar phenomenon occurring in Roman history, where barbarian tribes begin to coalesce and unify along the borders of a powerful state. In answer to the opportunities and threats posed by the greater power, the hitherto less unified, less hierarchical groups on the fringes begin to establish strong central leadership of their own. This process certainly could have occurred among the Southrons and later Easterlings, the former currying favor with Gondor, and the latter with Mordor during the War of the Ring, to increase the prestige of their dynasty or tribe and to secure greater wealth and power. Easterlings had apparently had some form of kingship, at least in the distant past of the Second Age. When evil men, survivors of Morgoth's downfall, returned into the East, men there took them for kings. We read also that the Dunedain could have been far superior to the evil kings of Middle-earth in crafting of weapons, though the term kings here seems broadly applied to all, whether in the East or South or elsewhere. All men in Middle-earth also had the model of Sauron, who was both king and god to them. It is noteworthy, then, that kings are never mentioned among the Wainriders. But then kingship seems only to have been synonymous with strength and power among the Dunedain, elves, and dwarves. When the men of the East and South have kings, they are either directly subordinate to some greater power, as in the Third Age, or far weaker than the men of the West, as in the Second. Kingship for the Easterlings is no guarantor of power, and it is telling that the word is always plural. We hear of kings, never a king. The impression is of a multiplicity of petty peoples. Since the Wainriders in their heyday were not an upstart group newly arisen on the fringes of a mighty kingdom, but rather a strong power in their own right, bursting through the decaying defenses of a declining realm, the circumstances that led to kings among the Haradrim and Easterlings at different points in the Third Age did not then exist. Intelligence in Gondor during the War of the Ring may have been more sophisticated and informed than in Narmekil II's day, but in the absence of any other evidence, we may take the apparent uncertainty of the chroniclers at their word. The statement that the Wainriders were a people, or a confederacy of many peoples, suggests that, remarkable as it may seem, there was no single central authority, no king or khan or emperor who commanded total authority. This lack of central leadership is evidenced in the ease with which the Wainriders of Rhovanion detached from their kin further east, and by the fact that while the Eotheod of 1899 had informants among the Wainriders of Rhovanion, and were able even to foment rebellion among their slave population, they named no single leader or even body of leaders, such as a tribal council, among them. To look at the positive evidence for Wainrider leadership, we are told that their chieftains fought in chariots. Chieftain may tell us little. At first glance it seems to be used almost indiscriminately for leader. Theoden throws down a chieftain of the Southrons before Minas Tirith, about whom nothing is known. But Tolkien is known for his precision. Looking at other applications of the term, we find that Frumgar was the name of the chieftain who led his people to Eotheod in 1977. Hereditary chieftains of Gondor are reported to have commanded the garrison at Aglarond during the Watchful Peace, and the leaders of the northern Dunedain after the fall of the North Kingdom are also called chieftains. These uses describe some inherited power, encompassing political as well as military matters, on a scale smaller than that of a king. We could suppose, then, that these chieftains fighting in chariots are the highest-level political leaders of the Wainriders. Heads of great families or tribes, perhaps coming together occasionally to determine broad policies or legal questions or the targets of invasions, but not ultimately answerable to political authority invested in a single individual. Is this plausible? Chariots are sophisticated machines, expensive to produce and maintain, especially in large numbers. We tend to associate chariots with the earliest powerful states to put them to use in an organized military, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and thus with the sort of despotic kingship that the Wainriders seem to have lacked. However, as has already been seen, steppe peoples are capable of forming complex but stateless societies, which can in turn produce artifacts of great effectiveness and artistry, including chariots. In the Sintashta culture referenced above, we can find evidence for a class of military elites characterized by aggrandizing behavior, which sounds similar indeed to what little we know of the Wainriders. In that culture, the competition between collectives of military elites for resources, power, and prestige brought into life the earliest chariot complex in the world. Therefore, it should pose no difficulty that the Wainrider people or peoples, without a centralized authority, could have coalesced into a force not only capable of producing chariots, but of contesting and indeed nearly overthrowing the might of Gondor. The picture resembles Ammianus Marcellinus's description of the Huns, They are not under the authority of a king, but are contented with the irregular government of their nobles, and under their lead they force their way through all obstacles. Christopher Kelly, author of The End of Empire, describes the Huns as a loose confederation of highly mobile, well-armed clans. Later, of course, the Huns would have kings. As for the Wainriders, they seem not to have had an Attila. Perhaps such a figure would have arisen had their confederacy not met defeat in 1944. Perhaps one did arise after that date, but turned his people's energies east rather than west, and thus never entered the annals of Gondor. What one historian has said about the early Huns could have been said about the Wainriders. There evidently was no Hun ruler in the 390s strong enough to enforce his will on all tribes, to prevent Hun groups from waging their own wars and making their own peace. As we have seen, the Wainriders of Rhovanion charted their own course for some 80 years before their eastern kinsfolk drifted into the region in search of plunder in the Middle Anduin. For their part, the eastern Wainriders between 1899 and 1944 spread and multiplied, and had been spreading southward beyond Mordor, and were in conflict with the peoples of Khand and their neighbors further south. These are not the descriptions of an intentional, carefully considered series of campaigns, but the kind of natural expansion that might occur among a group of peoples who have multiplied and are eager for conquests and booty. Only when their strength had been increased by the addition of allies in Khand and Harad did the eastern Wainriders feel capable of turning west and channeling their hatred for Gondor into the campaign of 1944, which in fact was probably the only campaign the Wainriders undertook, which had at its outset the aim of the invasion and occupation of Gondor. The first invasion of 1851 was focused on the subjugation of Rhovanion. The Battle of the Plains only marked the end of that invasion from the perspective of Gondor, as the Wainriders would spend an indeterminate amount of time afterwards completing their conquest. Likely it had begun in a similar way to the apparently gradual expansion of the eastern Wainriders mentioned above, with groups of chieftains leading their tribes or peoples against the similarly loosely affiliated groupings of Northmen, after the fashion of the Easterling attacks that had occurred in Minalcar's day. It is even possible that the Battle of the Plains was something of an accident, and there happened to be enough Wainrider bands nearby when Narmakil II's army approached for them to decide to risk battle. As we have seen, Kalimetar's 1899 victory over the Wainriders of Rhovanion was the result of the king's provocation of his enemies into battle. They seem to have responded in a poorly coordinated fashion, leaving the Undeeps unguarded. Only in the 1944 campaign do we see the Wainriders acting undoubtedly with long-reaching and complex strategic aims, the invasion and occupation of Gondor, and requiring the marshal of forces from several distant locations. This may indeed be ascribed to Sauron's influence, although the precise impact of this influence will be questioned in what follows. But in the events that led to this position of strength, the Wainriders needed no kings. Of course, in battle it is advantageous to establish a clear chain of command. The only indicator of Wainrider leadership, apart from the chieftains, can be found prior to the final climactic Battle of the Camp in 1944, where we are told that after overwhelming the rearguard of Minotaur, the chief commander of the Wainriders then called a halt to the advance and held a feast. It is important to note that chief commander is a phrase given by Christopher Tolkien, summarizing his father's notes on the Battle of the Camp. It is not certain if the term is the author's or the editor's. Regardless, the appearance of a single commander at this stage in the Wainrider campaign is remarkable. Nowhere else do we encounter reference to an individual Wainrider. Chief here seems to mean primary. The chief commander, then, would be the main or principal leader on a battlefield. The fact that no other title for this individual is given implies that his role is not that of a permanent or hereditary political authority, unlike the chieftains mentioned above. Unlike the kings who led the armies of Gondor, the chief commander of the Wainriders may have been a temporary appointee, selected by or among the chieftains to lead a campaign. The fact that we must rely on incomplete information from Gondor's historians makes it difficult for us to say much more about this position. The feast is described as being held by the chief commander, not merely ordered or commanded to be held. Like many peoples in Middle-earth, for the Wainriders, feasts would be important events, occasions to form or strengthen social bonds and reinforce or challenge social status. Holding a feast following 2 victorious engagements would seem to be a necessary step in reassessing the power dynamics within the Wainriders' coalition army. The responsibility for holding this important activity fell to the chief commander, which suggests that for the Wainriders there was perhaps no strict division between the military and social spheres. Responsible both for giving marching orders and for providing the food and drink for feasting, the chief commander would not only lead the host on the advance, but also oversee the event of the feast, at which we may imagine not only the celebratory reveling that preceded the Battle of the Camp, but also jockeying for prominence among the many chieftains. From the highest members of Wainrider society, we can turn to the lowest, since nothing is known of the middle tiers or classes. We know that the Wainriders enslaved the peoples of eastern and southern Rhovanion. These slaves, or some of them at least, would revolt in 1899. Presumably the numbers of slaves held by the Wainriders of Rhovanion was very large. This would perhaps suggest that slave ownership was not restricted to the chieftain class alone, if we knew how many chieftains were present in Wainrider society. Slavery on this scale is not unknown in Middle-earth. We have the example of Sauron's later operations in Nirn and the much earlier thraldom experienced in Hithlum and First Age Beleriand. But it is worth asking what the slaves of the Wainriders would have done. If the Wainriders had practiced pastoral nomadism and continued to practice it in Rhovanion, it seems unlikely that it would have been useful or feasible for them to control vast numbers of slaves, in addition to managing their herds over large distances. Perhaps then the Wainriders of Rhovanion settled down to an extent greater than other evidence can show. Regardless, it seems reasonable that the enslavement of the Northmen in Rhovanion was not an innovation, and that the Wainriders and their ancestors had practiced it in the East. However, the fact that the slave revolt of 1899 was incited by Northmen suggests that the slaves were themselves mostly Northmen, and that is, most of them were not brought out of the East. This in turn suggests the absence of a robust slave trade between the Wainriders of Rhovanion and the Eastern Wainriders, and further reinforces the picture of autonomy between the two groups. We also may raise the question of whether any of the Northmen of Rhovanion more or less willingly joined the Wainriders during or after the invasion and campaign of 1851. After the battle in which Narmekil II lost his life, there followed a period during which the Wainriders were content for the time to complete their conquest of Rhovanion. What this conquest entailed precisely would be interesting to know. We can assume that the first 5 years of the invasion, which culminated in the Battle of the Plains, had featured fighting, initial skirmish and battles with Northmen forces, raids and destruction of herds and settlements. We are told nothing of the Northmen resistance during this period other than that they ultimately lost. But the situation must have been more complex. Most of the Northmen were reduced to servitude after the Battle of the Plains. Servitude may or may not imply a slightly different state than slavery, but most indicates that some Northmen in the area did not become servants. Would some of these have remained to make new lives with the successful invaders? We know that Northmen in the past had been willing enough to side with Easterling attackers. Perhaps something similar happened on this occasion. Maybe it is even this that lies behind Faramir's otherwise strange statement that the Northmen often assailed Gondor before the days of the Stewards. A conquering force taking large numbers of the conquered population into its military is attested throughout history. Goths rode in the armies of Attila. If, as already suggested, the Goths are a reasonable analog for the Northmen of Rhovanion, then the Huns are an excellent analog for the Wainriders. Emerging suddenly on the open lands east of a divided, settled coastal empire, they first menaced the people on the border and then moved in to threaten the empire itself. But they acquired several of those bordering peoples as they went, and the Wainriders, a confederacy of many peoples, were already equipped to take in, more or less whole, those they conquered. In one significant sense, however, the Wainriders do not resemble the Huns. That is the total lack of evidence for any diplomatic engagement, let alone realpolitik, between themselves and Gondor. Hunnic groups alternated between serving and attacking Roman armies. Attila, the Scourge of God, was named Magister Militum. But the Wainriders seem never to have wanted anything that Gondor could have given them: alliance, wealth, titles. Land they would take in Rhovanion. Plunder and conquest was their material aim in 1944. But beyond this, hatred of Gondor, which stood in their way, must also be acknowledged as a motivation, particularly in the latter campaign. This hatred seems to be the only explanation for the fact that the only encounters between Easterlings and men of the West throughout their entire long history took the form of raids and battle, never diplomatic negotiation. Even at the close of the War of the Ring, the Easterlings are the most recalcitrant of Gondor's foes. Elessar made peace with the peoples of Harad, indicating some level of diplomatic recognition. We have already seen that High Armendakil I commanded homage and overlordship from the kings of the Harad. No such Gondorian authority ever existed in the East, nor was it attempted. Gondor spoke to the East only in the language of war. After Sauron's defeat, Elessar pardoned the Easterlings that had given themselves up and sent them away free. While this is the closest we have to any communication between men of the West and those of the East, it is the action of a merciful judge toward a repentant criminal, not a treaty or agreement between states. It would seem that the many peoples of the East would have been very fertile ground for political intervention on the part of Gondor, whether by playing tribe against tribe in order to prevent the rise of powerful coalitions, or by cultivating friendship with gifts and embassies to draw certain groups into Gondor's orbit. But it is difficult to tell whether Gondor's failure to even attempt such strategies was a consequence of the Easterlings' fierce hatred, or one of its causes. During the Wainrider period, then, some form of oligarchic rule seems to have obtained. The chieftains mentioned were perhaps the leaders of the peoples, or tribes that together constituted the different peoples, who together made up the Confederacy. But who, if anyone, was behind the centripetal drawing together of the Confederacy to begin with? Sauron seems unlikely. His role was to stir up, to set them on their path, to aim them against the West, and when this aim failed, as in the wars of the Eastern Wainriders against Khand and Nir-Harad, to help guide all parties back on course. Something allowed the horsemen of Marhuini in 1899 to identify the Wainriders of Rhovanion as folk of Sauron. Was this anything more than the ascription to a distant devil of all misfortune? It seems unlikely that the Wainriders would have openly declared any allegiance to Sauron, since such a declaration would certainly have been mentioned or described by the chroniclers. Also at this time, Sauron was in hiding. A combination of factors, then, likely led to the formation of the Wainrider Confederacy. Rumors of both the threat and wealth of Gondor, a general sense of opportunity to the West, a desire to rejuvenate their society in the wake of defeat and plague. However, despite having spent many years in the East before relocating to Dol Guldur at the beginning of the Third Age, Sauron himself seems not to have been the direct cause. It is remarkable that if there was a cultural memory of Sauron's lordship in the East, the kind of central autocratic authority he surely wielded was, as far as we know, not copied by the Wainriders, the most powerful successors of the region to threaten the West. Perhaps their confederacy of many peoples was merely a consequence of lacking the organizational wherewithal to establish such an office. Perhaps instead it was a conscious decision, a reaction against the centralized rule of a single leader, either out of resentment at Sauron's apparent failure to deliver his subjects in the East decisive victory against their enemies, or simply because of the real difficulties inherent in forcing such a system over disparate groups who seem to have operated in a semi-nomadic fashion over great distances. We may compare the development of the Wainrider Confederacy with that of a state we know to have been created by Sauron more or less out of whole cloth, the witch realm of Angmar. Like the East, the territory of Angmar was populated by men not of Númenorian descent. While we hear of no battles between the northern Dúnedain and native men prior to the rise of Angmar, we can suppose that conflict between the peoples was likely, even without interference from Sauron or his emissaries. Arnor comprised the fertile lowlands, and the hillmen, who seem to have been local to parts of Rhudaur, would have been spread through higher ground eastward, toward the Misty Mountains and Etten Moors. It is easy to imagine these native hillmen becoming involved in the frequent strife that occurred between the lesser kingdoms of Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur following Arnor's division, possibly fighting in the armies of Rhudaur. We also hear of evil men being gathered to Angmar following that realm's founding. It is not clear whether they are of the same stock as the hillmen, but if they do not represent renegade Dunedain, they must have their origin in some indigenous population. The hillmen who later seize power in Rhudaur seem to belong to a distinct group, otherwise their secret league with Angmar would not have been secret. At Angmar's founding, the realm consists not only of evil men, but of orcs and other fell creatures. The absolute monarch, of course, is the Witch King himself, Lord of the Nazgul. Seeing the opportunity to destroy the northern Dunedain completely, Sauron sent his chief servant. But after 1409, we hear no more of the Hillmen. Rhudaur, despite its evil Lord of the Hillmen having been in secret league with Angmar, is now occupied by evil men subject to Angmar, apparently of a different sort. No reason is given for the deposition of the Hillmen rule which had been established with Angmar's consent or instigation over 50 years before. Perhaps the Hillmen proved uncooperative or unruly allies. Perhaps they resented the no doubt extreme autocratic rule of the Witch King. Maybe they were simply unable to provide the kind of support the Witch King preferred to use. After their time, we hear of evil spirits out of Angmar and Rhudaur being sent to inhabit the Barrow Downs. In Peoples of Middle-earth, there is an earlier version of this narrative. Though no hillmen are mentioned, the broad outlines of events are similar. First, in Rhudaur, power has been seized by men in secret league with Angmar, and then, years later, in Rhudaur, an evil folk, workers of sorcery, subjects of Angmar, slay the remnants of the Dunedain and build dark forts in the hills. Taken together, these accounts seem to describe a population being used in an early phase to undermine the power of the Dunedain of Rhudaur, but the next phase would see these men cast aside in favor of the workers of sorcery, who are more directly subject to the Witch King. Overall, Angmar shows evidence of being willing enough to use the local population for its initial purposes, but it keeps them on an extremely short leash. Only for a few decades did the Hillmen dynasty rule in Rhudaur. The Witch King was swift to bring in his own loyal subjects to work his will directly. In contrast, the Wainrider Confederacy seems too large and varied to be under the rule of a single leader. It took the Lord of the Nazgul to establish and rule Angmar, a much smaller territory even than that controlled by the Wainriders of Rovanion, which was only one of the regional zones controlled by the peoples of the Wainriders. The allied hillmen were used opportunistically and then apparently deposed as part of the continual centralization of power. For the Wainriders, many peoples seemed to remain within the Confederacy, apparently retaining their separate identities. Could all or some of the remaining Nazgul nevertheless have established the Wainrider Confederacy? Prior to 1856, the location of the Ringwraiths is unknown, but they may have been in Dol Guldur with Sauron himself. It is said of the initial Wainrider invasion and Battle of the Plains that, at this time, 1856, it is thought that the Ringwraiths re-entered Mordor. Supposing the thought reflects reality, this does not seem to be the move made by a leader. The Witch King remained in Angmar apparently throughout its existence. If the other lesser Ringwraiths had managed to establish or somehow inspire the creation of the Wainrider Confederacy, their departure from the east at the very beginning of its wars with Gondor would seem to be an abdication of their leadership. We might suppose that some of the Ringwraiths remained to oversee affairs, perhaps Kamul the Easterling, but we could disregard any prior loyalties or motivations on the part of the Ringwraiths. At this time they are wholly Sauron's creatures, whatever their past lives may have been, and we would expect any Ringwraith rule of the East to be marked by the same ruthless moves toward centralized authority that we see in Angmar. Ultimately, it is likely that the Ringwraiths, if they indeed re-entered Mordor around 1856, were more intent on preparing the ground in Mordor for their master's return, rather than guiding affairs in the East. Our only evidence of Sauron's involvement after the Wainriders' initial stirring up prior to the first invasions seems to be the organization of the peace and alliance between the Wainriders, Khand, and Harad that would allow the assault upon Gondor to continue. If the Ringwraiths could have brought about the destruction of Gondor by their overt involvement in the Wainrider assaults, no doubt they would have. But the time was not ripe. Only in Angmar, on a much smaller scale, was it possible for their leader to organize a realm that was single-minded and utterly loyal. And even Angmar shows signs of how far Sauron had fallen since the Second Age. Neither here nor in the East do we detect any remnant of the worship of Sauron as a god that we saw earlier. If Sauron's influence on the Wainriders was minor or indirect, how might it have been affected? An analogue may be seen in the Council of the Men of Estelad in Beleriand during the First Age. The assembly had met to determine whether to remain where they lived or to leave the elves to their war with Morgoth. Into the assembly came one who seemed to be one of their own leaders, exhorting them with fell words that shook the hearts of all who heard him to abandon the cause of the elves. It was afterward discovered that this was one of the spies or emissaries of the Dark Lord. While the identity of this spy or emissary is unknown, the deception is consistent with Sauron's methods, and one can easily imagine how Sauron could have employed a similar strategy with the Wainrider chieftains, first inciting them to spend their strength against the Northmen bulwark of Gondor in 1851, and then encouraging them to cease their wars with Khand and Harad before 1944, no doubt inflaming them with greed for the spoils of the kingdom. However, the very success of the Wainriders is indicative of their relative freedom from Sauronian interference. They emerge as the most formidable Easterlings to threaten Gondor, and they arise at precisely the same time when Sauron is denied access to their core homelands east of the Sea of Rhûn. Evidently, it was only at the early height of his power in the Second Age, following the forging of the Rings of Power, that Sauron showed an interest in cultivating the strength of men. In this period, in the east and south, men grew strong and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce in war and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. This position of strength held for roughly a millennium and a half. But after Sauron's defeat in the War of the Last Alliance, he seems not to have troubled himself with propping up the realms of men. The first Easterling attacks in the Third Age are conducted by wild men out of the east, hordes. The language of the chroniclers implies lack of organization and sophistication. They attack when Sauron had been in the east for centuries, most able to directly intervene in their development. But if he played a role, it seems only to have been to impel them westward. Later, after Sauron has been driven back into the east for over 400 years, the Balcoth appear. But they are only rudely armed and lacked in gear of war, with no great number of horses for riding, lack of horses being almost a Sauronic trope. The Balcoth keep the wains, but have lost the chariots of their forebears. And even in the War of the Ring, Sauron's Easterlings are known to be grim, strong, and war-hardened. They are not known for their tactical skill or the quality of their gear. Ultimately, in the Third Age, it seems Sauron saw the men of the East much as the Witch King saw the hillmen of Rhudaur, a tool to be used, not improved. But Sauron was not the only power at work in the East. The Istari, the wizards, appeared in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, a period roughly coinciding with the height of Gondor's power. Curunir, known also as Saruman, journeyed often into the East before making his home at Isengard. What he found there is, of course, unknown. Sauron was at the time in Dol Guldur, and the memory of his rule in the previous age must have been fading. Curunir means man of skill. Like Sauron, he was associated with Aule and was interested in clever craft and power. We do not have a date for his frequent journeys, but he settled in Isengard in 2759, by which time he was presumably earnestly pursuing his charge. Nevertheless, it is possible that his travels in the East, if, as is likely, they occurred prior to the Wainrider period, had some impact on the development of Easterling society. The Blue Wizards, like Saruman, had most likely gone into the East before the Wainrider period. This is because we hear of Sauron being driven away from Dol Guldur in 2063, but are not given the impression that the Blue Wizards were involved in this action, presumably because they were absent. They too may then have had an impact on the course of Easterling and Wainrider development. They passed into the east with Curunir, but they never returned, and whether they remained in the east, pursuing there the purposes for which they were sent, or perished, or as some hold were ensnared by Sauron and became his servants, is not now known. The Blue Wizard's characteristics are not as clearly drawn as those of the other known three, but we learn that one of them, Alatar, who was sent by Orome, was one of only two who came forward willingly to undertake the task in Middle-earth, the other being Curunir. It is said of the other Blue Wizard, Pallando, that Alatar took him as a friend. Alatar's eagerness to go to Middle-earth and the journeying in friendship with Pallando are auspicious beginnings to their work. The Blue Wizard's association with Orome is noteworthy. Orome is the Vala most strongly associated with the regions of the East, in his legendary hunts through Middle-earth, and the wild white kine of the East are said to descend from the kine of Ara. However, there seem to be two different traditions regarding the Blue Wizard's impact in the East. On the one hand, they may have failed, as Saruman did, though doubtless in different ways, and become founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. Since, unlike in Angmar, there is no hint of any sorcery or other cultic traditions among the Wainriders, who must have been observed closely, at least in their stolen lands in Rovanion, by the outlaw agents of Marwini prior to the slave uprising of 1899, we may discount this sort of influence from the Blue Wizards. The alternate tradition of the Blue Wizards suggests that they came to Middle-earth much earlier, in the Second Age, with different names. Morinetar and Romestamo, Darkness Slayer and East Helper. Their task was to circumvent Sauron, to bring help to the few tribes of men that had rebelled from Melkor worship, to stir up rebellion, and after his first fall to search out his hiding, in which they failed, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. They must have had very great influence on the history of the Second Age and Third Age in weakening and disarraying the forces of the East, who would, both in the Second and Third Age, otherwise have outnumbered the West. It is impossible to tell precisely what such weakening would have looked like in connection with the Wainriders, if indeed there was any such connection. But the Blue Wizards could have met with success by preventing the rise to power of a single central authority who might have achieved more than the Wainrider Confederacy. Or perhaps they propped up other realms that acted as a check on Wainrider expansion in those directions. Khand comes to mind. It is also arguably possible for both traditions to be true, that the Blue Wizards fell from their original purpose and introduced cultic traditions into the farther reaches of the East, but nevertheless managed to distract or weaken the Wainriders themselves, preventing them from attaining the strength necessary to topple Gondor. Whatever the case, it seems likely that the Blue Wizards remained peripheral to the Wainrider Confederacy. However it happened, in 1851 the Wainriders appeared, stronger and better armed than any other Easterlings. Only after Sauron's tyrannical, totalizing interference had been gone for some 8 centuries could the people of the East coalesce into a truly formidable force in their own right. Sauron was willing enough to spur the Easterlings on against his enemies and spend their lives in his wars, but he did nothing to cultivate their society or craftsmanship. In the end, he would have replaced them all with orcs. Although the Wainrider Wars ended in defeat for the Easterlings, they accomplished Sauron's ultimate aim, the weakening of Gondor and the opening of Mordor. Even in the very days of Eärnil, the hero of the Battle of the Camp and last but one of the kings of Gondor, the Nazgul made their first stroke, and they came by night out of Mordor over the passes of the Mountains of Shadow, and took Minas Ithil for their abode, and they made it a place of such dread that none dared to look upon it. Thereafter it was called Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and Minas Morgul was ever at war with Minas Anor in the west. Then Osgiliath, which in the waning of the people had long been deserted, became a place of ruins and a city of ghosts. The swiftness with which Sauron was able to press the advantage bought by the struggle of the Wainriders against Gondor is evidence, if any were needed, that he had been closely following, if not steering, the entire affair. In the end, then, can we say that the Wainriders, in their sudden rise, expansion, and ultimate downfall, were no more than tools of Sauron, a cat's paw to leverage while he remained hidden and furthered his true aims? I think we can say that they were more than this. Sauron was all too happy to seize the opportunity of the coalescing power of the Easterling peoples, but it is unlikely he had a hand in drawing them together in the first place. His emissaries stirred them up, that is, goaded them to attack Gondor, but it is not claimed that they did any more than this, and probably the Wainriders needed little encouragement to strike westward, along the path of so many prior Easterling invasions. We have observed that at times they seemed to act in their own rather than Sauron's interests, making war upon other folk that Sauron saw fit to end. And in the event, their apparent organization of tribes or peoples not directed by a single autocratic ruler, and the unique elements of their society, such as the training in arms of their young women and, of course, their chariots and wains, seem to have developed naturally, rather than being imposed or suggested by Sauron. The apparently polyethnic character of the Wainrider Confederacy may seem at first glance to serve as a point of contrast between this new Easterling group and the Kingdom of Gondor. The chroniclers seem to emphasize the unity of Gondor's people and her Númenórean ancestry, and to lament the mingling that would occur throughout her history. In fact, Gondor had always contained many peoples. Gondor comprised the Númenórean strain as well as folk of the coasts, western hills, and people of eastern Enedwaith, later Dunland, who would only cease to be subjects of the kingdom after the days of the kings had ended. The Northmen themselves would be taken in and retain their separate identity within Gondor's borders for hundreds of years, at least from Romendakill II's day until 1974, when proud princes of Rhovanion were fielded against the Witch King of Angmar, more than a century after Rhovanion itself had been lost to them forever. Even the men of the mountains, whose ancient relatives in the dark years had worshipped Sauron, were reimagined in Faramir's day as the hardy mountaineers of arid Nimraeus. The real difference was not that the Wainriders contained many peoples, but that the Wainriders evidently lacked a dominant strain in their confederacy. What would have been surprising, even objectionable to Gondor, was not that many peoples constituted a single polity, but that that polity had no head, that there was no senior member designated by ancestry or nobility to lead the other lesser parts. No doubt to the chroniclers, the fact that the Wainriders came on in little order prior to the Battle of the Camp would have been viewed as a natural consequence of the disorder of their entire society. The Wainriders had no king, but many chieftains, and seemed to have taken in new peoples unassimilated. We may see early phases of this process in the Eastern Wainriders' campaign against Khand. While the Wainriders seem to have won dominance in the region, Khand joined the Confederacy as an ally. That Sauron doubtless had a hand in the peace and alliance does not undermine the point that the Wainriders would not have been a confederacy of many peoples had they insisted on subsuming all those peoples under a single authority. When the Wainriders advanced into Ithilien in 1944, exulting and singing songs of victory, the songs would have been in many tongues. And their last known campaign was worthy of song. They had traveled 500 miles from their muster at the Sea of Rhûn, and had defeated their great enemy in at least 2 engagements. Feasting and reveling in camp, battle behind and plunder ahead, they must have felt at home. Denethor II, the last ruling steward of Gondor, said that Vorondil, father of Mardil, hunted the wild kine of Arrah in the far fields of Rhûn. In the annals of the kings and rulers, Vorondil the Hunter is identified as steward before Mardil, who was the first of the ruling stewards. In fact, Vorondil was steward during much of the reign of King Eärnil, Gondor's hero of the Battle of the Camp. A note says that the wild white kine that were still to be found near the Sea of Rhûn were said in legend to be descended from the kine of Arrah, the huntsman of the Valar, who alone of the Valar came often to Middle-earth in the Elder Days. Orome is the High Elven form of his name. Vorondil died in Third Age 2029. We are not given a date for his birth or for his expedition, but he could not have gone hunting in the far fields of Rhûn prior to the Wainrider defeat of 1944. Although we are not told that the Wainrider realms of Rhovanion or further east collapsed immediately after the Battle of the Camp, The victory won by Eärnil must have affected some decline in their territories, to the point where it was possible for so important a figure as Verondil to travel across the Anduin maybe mere decades after the final Wainrider invasion, through territory that had long been enemy-held or deserted, and approach the inland sea that had last been even nominally part of Gondor's borderland only prior to the Wainrider invasions themselves. While Verondil's deeds as a huntsman were of far less impact to the Easterlings than Minalcar's eastward destruction of their camps and settlements some 800 years earlier, the Steward's expeditions mark a fitting coda to the Wainrider period. Gondor would never completely destroy the power of the Easterlings, but Verondil earned the epithet the Hunter for his prowess in the east. Although the Wainriders had been supreme in the region within living memory, so far as we know, none of their descendants hindered his trek. A horn from one of the great kine would be cut off, bound with silver and written with ancient characters. It would remain a badge of the eldest son of the Steward until Boromir's death above the falls of Rauros.